If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. He was the first graduate in the history of the military academy at West Point to be promoted to a general's rank in the regular army. He was the most senior U.S. Army officer to resign his commission and go south to fight for the Confederacy in 1861. He was the only man to command both of the Confederacy's principal field armies, the Army of Northern Virginia in 1861 to 1862, and the Army of Tennessee in 1864. Yet Joseph E. Johnston is left out of many people's pantheon of generals that emerged during the American Civil War. Johnston's grandfather immigrated to North America, specifically Virginia, in 1726, settling near Petersburg, Virginia. His name was Peter Johnston, and he was a merchant. His son was also named Peter. When the American Revolution broke out and the colonists began to form an army to fight the British, Peter the Younger joined the American army at the age of 16, fighting under Light Horse Harry Lee, the future father of Robert E. Lee. When the war concluded, young Peter was a lieutenant. He married Mary Valentine Wood, the niece of famed Virginian Patrick Henry. Their first child died in infancy. The seventh child was born on February 3, 1807, and named Joseph Eggleston Johnston, in honor of one of Peter's commanders during the Revolution. Peter was elected a judge in 1811 and was assigned to a circuit in central Virginia, but he traded with Judge William Brockenbrough and moved to southwestern Virginia to the town of Abingdon, just a few miles from the Tennessee border. Peter would build a 2-story log house just outside the town with 2 fireplaces and a whitewashed exterior. Joe and his brothers attended the Abingdon Academy, where his father was on the board of trustees. The young Johnston men were products of the frontier despite Abingdon being a thriving center along a main route from east to west. The wilds of Virginia and Tennessee awaited the boys and on multiple occasions journeyed over the mountains into Tennessee, under the watchful eye of a family slave. On one of these occasions, Joe was thrown from his horse and broke his leg, with the bone sticking out of the skin. The resilient young man was in good humor and said to his comrades, "Hello, boys, come here and look. The confounded bone has come clean through." The group carried the wounded boy on their shoulders to the nearest doctor miles away. One moment in American history that captured the mind of Johnston was the Battle of Kings Mountain, the Revolutionary War engagement that saw the over-the-mountain men, mostly of the Watauga and Nolichucky River settlements, cross into South Carolina and defeat a British force under Patrick Ferguson. Since many of the over-the-mountain men gathered near Abingdon, the story of the engagement was told and retold and took on mythical proportions. Johnston heard these stories and would reenact the battle with his friends. Joseph came to view military triumphs as the measure of a man. He was so obsessed with the military that his father recognized it and bestowed upon him the military sword he carried into battle during the Revolution. Joseph was only 8 years old, with many older brothers, but he was the one his father chose to give the sword to. That sword would be an icon in Joseph's life. This became a driving force for him when he applied to the United States Military Academy at West Point. His father wrote to the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, and told him that his son had the necessary education for entrance and that he himself was a Revolutionary War veteran, and informed Calhoun that no one from that section of Virginia had yet to be sent to West Point. Calhoun was convinced, and Joseph was admitted into the academy. In June 1825, Johnston traveled along rugged trails and roads to New York to get on a steamboat in New York City for a ride up the Hudson River to the academy. The young man taking that steamboat up the river was about 5'7", rail thin, deep brown eyes, brown hair chopped close, and had a broad forehead. The vessel steamed up the Hudson and landed at the academy, where Johnston got his first look at his home for the next 4 years. He entered the class of 1829 with 105 other cadets. The plebes lived in a tent city, took a preliminary exam to make sure they were ready academically to enter the academy, and then their lives as cadets began. They drilled 3 times a day, 5:30 a.m. to 7 a.m., noon to 1, and from 5 to 7 in the evening. The first-classmen were in attendance to watch with critical eyes the movements of the new cadets. One of those was Albert Sidney Johnston of Louisiana, no relation to Joseph. Other young men attending West Point at the same time as Johnston was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. The heavy demerit-receiving Davis nearly got dismissed from the academy for sneaking away to Benny Haven's tavern, but narrowly avoided being kicked out of the school. This stands in stark contrast to the well-behaved Johnston, who didn't receive a single demerit that summer and only accumulated 7 during that first academic year. The Abingdon Academy hadn't completely prepared Johnston for the academics at West Point. He struggled, especially with math. That first year, mathematics and French was the 2 main subjects for the plebes. Through hard study, Johnston became adept at reading and translating French military texts, and later on, his library would be filled with French novels, biographies, and histories. That first year at West Point was difficult for Johnston for another reason, other than his math classes. He received word in November that his mother had passed away. He asked, "How is it possible for me to bear the loss of such a mother, the best, the tenderest, the most virtuous, with other than the greatest anguish?" His depression at the loss of his mother led him to shy away from social circles. He would write, "Alone, without a single friend to sympathize in my grief, surrounded and almost distracted by the noise and laughter of idle young men far differently situated from myself, my situation is rendered still more miserable by the contrast between their feelings and my own." However, he did find a friend. Out of the 9 Virginians who came into West Point with Johnston, only 2 remained, Johnston and a young man from the Tidewater region of Virginia, Robert E. Lee. The 2 men were drawn together, 1 because of their father's history together, and 2 because both shied away from the activities that would result in demerits. Lee was better academically and on the drill field, but that didn't stop Johnston from improving upon himself. Johnston later in life would comment, "In youth and early manhood, I loved and admired him more than any man in the world." As Johnston progressed through school, his weak mathematical foundation showed through, but he did well in tactics, artillery drill, and began to excel in French. His drawing skills wasn't any better than his math. Nevertheless, Johnston worked hard. He wasn't naturally intelligent, but worked for his grades. Through his academic career at West Point, he was promoted to cadet lieutenant. But, for unknown reasons, Johnston was removed from that position. It may have been because during his time at West Point, he got an infection in his eyes and was unable to see at night, and the disability convinced the academic staff to remove Johnston because he may not be able to perform his duties adequately. But that's just a theory. Although he never achieved a higher rank at the academy other than cadet lieutenant, his friends gave him the nickname the Colonel. Although this may have been a compliment, one of his biographers hypothesizes that perhaps Johnston's peers also sought to mock him gently for his somber demeanor, for the tag implied fastidiousness and old age. Colonels in the U.S. Army of the 1820s were ancient, dignified souls, and despite his youth, Johnston was a model of restraint and dignity. In 1829, Johnston graduated 13th out of 46 cadets. He received the rank of second lieutenant in the 4th U.S. Artillery, part of which was stationed at Fort Columbus on Governor's Island in New York. Because most of the artillery guarded the seacoast, a position in the artillery most likely meant monotonous duty on the Atlantic coast. It was a boring post. Society in New York City mitigated some of that boredom, but he was still thirsting for the heroic and dashing military life that he read about in his books as a child and in the retelling of the Battle of Kings Mountain he heard as a boy in Abingdon. Johnston stayed at Fort Columbus for 2 uneventful years. In August 1831, a slave rebellion known as Nat Turner's Rebellion left at least 60 whites dead, as well as the slaves who rose up and attacked the plantations in Southampton County, Virginia. In response to the violence, Johnston and his battery were ordered to Fort Monroe on the peninsula in Virginia formed by the York and James Rivers. While there, he and others were to become students at the Artillery School of Practice located at Fort Monroe. Although it may have been designed to teach about artillery and its mechanics, one general claimed it was to guard against the approaches of sloth and imbecility, or simply to give soldiers stationed there something to do and to keep them out of trouble. At the School of Practice, the soldiers also cast musket balls and made cartridges for the infantry. This was called laboratory instruction, which lasted about 3 hours per day. Not all was work. There was still a lot of downtime, and Johnston found one of his friends, Robert E. Lee, at the fort. At night, the two would prowl around visiting junior officers and having discussions into the night. Johnston would also get to know the ladies around Fort Monroe, and became infatuated with some of them. When his sister-in-law accused him of being in love, Johnston wrote, "I am not, never was more than a philosopher should be. I am 24, too old to believe in romance and sentimentality, and too much a philosopher to be under their influence, even if they really existed." The next year, in 1832, Chief Black Hawk of the Sauk tribe and his people broke their agreement with the United States, and crossed back over the Mississippi River to their homelands in Illinois. What resulted was the Black Hawk War, and artillery units would be mobilized for that war, but converted into infantry for the duration of the conflict. Major General Winfield Scott created this army that would go into the frontier. For Johnston, he was thrilled to be leaving Fort Monroe. He wrote, "I am heartily tired of this sandbank. It is the most villainous abode ever occupied." Johnston and the others chosen for this expedition traveled by boat to New York City, then traveled to Albany, then took the Erie Canal to Buffalo, New York. From there, they would get on steamboats destined for Detroit. The group got on 4 steamers to travel through the Great Lakes. Soon after leaving Buffalo, what was called Asiatic cholera began to spread throughout the 4 ships. The suddenness of the illness was the most striking part about it. Within 6 hours, a person could be dead. Out of about 850 soldiers who began the journey, only 200 were fit for duty when they reached their destination, Fort Dearborn, modern-day Chicago, Illinois. Johnston didn't contract the disease, but it did debilitate the entire contingent. Johnston waited at Fort Dearborn, while Scott went to catch up to General Atkinson, whose soldiers had basically ended the war in the Battle of Bad Axe before Scott arrived. Johnston caught up to Scott at Fort Armstrong on Rock Island in the Mississippi River, near the modern-day cities of Davenport, Iowa, and Moline, Illinois. There, Scott held negotiations with the Native American tribes, but without Chief Black Hawk. The other leaders, without Black Hawk, quickly signed an agreement to not come east of the Mississippi River and basically stay 50 miles from the west side of the Mississippi River. Johnston signed the document as a witness, representing his only active role during the campaign. Johnston headed back east to Fort Monroe, but was called away again because of a national crisis. The tariff bills, known as the Tariff of Abominations in the South, upset South Carolina so much that they decided to nullify the federal law. President Andrew Jackson dispatched troops to Charleston in the event of a rebellion, and Johnston was chosen to be one of those soldiers stationed around that southern city. Johnston's political views aren't known about nullification, but most of his family were states' rights Democrats, and 3 of his brothers were now living in South Carolina and had joined the militia. They would be the enemy to Johnston if violence broke out. However, the only battle that raged was the one in Congress, and the situation was worked out, with South Carolina rescinding their nullification. Johnston went back to Fort Monroe by way of a steamer traversing the Atlantic coast. The jostling on the ocean during all of his sea voyages made him horribly seasick. He remained at Fort Monroe for about 6 months, then was sent to Alabama in December 1833 to keep the peace between the land-hungry whites and the Creek tribe. Johnston would write about the expedition, "Think of riding so long at the rate of 15 miles per day, generally in the rain and through the most uninteresting country that has ever been created. Life is short, and I am totally opposed to loss of time, and time can never be more completely lost or misspent than a winter here. Imagine yourself living in a tent, compelled to employ yourself chiefly in turning round before a fire like meat on a spit to keep warm, and consequently unable to pursue any rational occupation, and you may form an estimate of the winter I am to pass." By the spring, his unit was preparing to leave to go back to Fort Monroe, but Johnston found it hard to leave by this point. He had become smitten by at least one pretty Creek girl, but his military duties pulled him away from her. After only a short time at Fort Monroe, he was dispatched to Washington in order to help draft maps of the Midwest. Then, in 1835, he was given orders that would result in him finally fighting a human enemy on a campaign. The Seminole tribe in Florida were putting up resistance to relocation, and a war had broken out. Johnston and his group moved at once to Florida to help suppress the Native Americans there. In January 1836, Congress began funding a full-scale war against the Seminoles. Also in January, Johnston was appointed to General Winfield Scott's staff as aide-de-camp. One of Johnston's biographers explained the important moment. The young second lieutenant had barely attracted Scott's notice during the Black Hawk campaign, but now, as a member of Scott's staff, Johnston could not only observe the war firsthand from its highest levels, he would also have an opportunity to win the favor of an influential patron. Johnston's assignment was a high-profile job for a young and ambitious officer, and he was determined to make the most of it. Johnston and the group traveled to a location west of St. Augustine, then moved overland to Fort Drane. There, Scott concocted a plan to trap the Seminoles with 3 contingents, one coming from the east, another coming from the west, and his own larger force attacking from a northerly direction. The other 2 groups were slowed down by the marshy terrain and didn't make contact with one another. Scott's force with Johnston made it to the Withlacoochee River and a lake named the Cove of the Withlacoochee. It was here that Johnston first heard shots fired in anger, as Seminole warriors from the forest surrounding the lake and from the banks of the river fired at soldiers attempting to cross. The Seminoles fought a rear guard action, not standing to fight, but wearing away at Scott's army as it crossed the swamps of Florida. Scott and Johnston pursued them for several miles, but then gave up the chase when Seminoles crossed a river that Scott's men would have too much difficulty doing under fire. Johnston's army marched south to Fort Brooke, arriving there on April 5th. A Creek uprising in Alabama got the attention of Scott, who set off to put down the Native Americans, but he didn't bring Johnston. For about another year, Johnston suffered in the Florida heat, commanded by some men who feuded with Scott and wouldn't entrust soldiers to a former aide to Scott. Thus, Johnston languished in obscurity. Finally, in May 1837, Johnston did what many West Pointers did that year: resign. Out of the 117 officer resignations that year, 99 of them were West Pointers. He watched as juniors to him received promotions over him because they were connected to a specific regiment. The pay was horrible, especially when a trained engineer like him could make 5 times more in civilian life with the demand for infrastructure, and the nation didn't appreciate West Point trained soldiers at this time. They uplifted the militia and turned against the professionally trained soldiers. He had rose only 1 rank in his nearly 8 years of service after West Point and decided to see what awaited him in civilian life. He packed his things and went back to Virginia. Under normal circumstances, a West Point graduate entering the civilian workforce could expect to land a good job constructing railroads, canals, bridges, or other infrastructure. However, Johnston couldn't have picked a worse time to leave the Army. He left during the Panic of 1837. President Andrew Jackson and his war with the Bank of the United States resulted in an economic downturn, and less projects were being funded around the country because of the lack of money. Financially, Johnston was hurting, so he turned to the government, specifically the Topographical Bureau, to work for them. It wasn't a lot of money, but it would be a steady paycheck in an uncertain time. He figured that his main role would be to draft maps, but the government sent Johnston back to Florida to help survey the 450-mile coastline from St. Augustine to the Florida Keys. He would join a group of sailors and soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Levin Powell, with Johnston being the only civilian in the group. It was a diverse group of men. The Navy had been enlisting free black men for years, so the group of sailors and soldiers contained a good amount of African American men. Johnston rekindled his friendship with another Virginian he had known from West Point, John B. Magruder. The band of men set up camp at Mosquito Lagoon. It was now December 1837, and the men celebrated Christmas with a holiday dinner of gopher soup and whiskey toddy. That night, Magruder, a future Confederate general, and William French, a future Union general, serenaded the group of men. The group explored the Florida coast and moved along the Jupiter River, where they found a herd of cattle and horses being tended by a lone Seminole woman. They interrogated the woman, and she agreed to take the soldiers to a Seminole camp. It wasn't this group's responsibility to fight Seminoles, but Powell was eager to get into a fight after an earlier attempt led him to search in vain for the elusive enemy. Powell would lead just 80 men, the majority of them sailors, to the location specified by the Seminole woman. Johnston, being a civilian now, didn't have to come, but he wanted to get into the fight just as bad as Powell. The soldiers and sailors surprised the Seminole camp with an attack, but when the Seminoles began to fire back, the sailors, many of whom had just recently been put on active duty, began to panic and refused to fire their weapons. Johnston was in the thick of the fight, attempting to get his men back into it. He alleged that he found 30 bullet holes in his clothes, with 2 in his hat. 1 bullet scraped his scalp, but it wasn't enough to take him out of the fight, but left a permanent scar. The group of men fell back in near panic as a rear guard of about 25 men prevented the attack from becoming a total disaster. A contemporary later testified that Johnston's coolness, courage, and judgment won the admiration of everyone in the party. Johnston was the last one to reach the landing site and the last to board the boats. So eager was he to ensure that every member of the party was accounted for that he was almost left behind. Johnston concluded that we escaped by God's help. The small battle was the first time that Johnston commanded troops in combat. Oddly enough, it was when he was a civilian. Johnston's main role was to choose sites for fortifications along the coast. When the group continued their mission, they stopped where Powell had made camp over a year earlier. Powell called it Fort Dallas, but it was simply a camping area. Johnston was ordered to begin construction of a blockhouse, one of the first buildings, in what would become Miami, Florida. Many of the Seminoles lived and operated out of the Everglades in southern Florida, and when the group of sailors and soldiers got to that marshy landscape, Powell again wanted to strike at the Seminoles. Johnston and others drug boats through the swamps because a drought reduced many of the waterways to just 1 foot deep. They attacked the Seminoles on a little island, but couldn't land a decisive blow before the Seminoles made their escape. The group then got to the Florida Keys, where they went their separate ways, with the Navy going to Pensacola and the Army going back to St. Augustine and other points north. Johnston would leave Florida in April 1838 and go back to Washington. In 5 months, Johnston had explored and surveyed over 450 miles of the Florida coast from St. Augustine to Key West. He had selected the sites for several forts and helped supervise their construction. He had fought in 2 battles with the Indians and provided evidence of both his bravery in combat and his leadership, and he had been mentioned favorably in dispatches. He had seen more combat during his year as a civilian than in his 7 years as an artillery officer. Not incidentally, he had demonstrated his ability to fulfill the duties of a topographical engineering officer. All in all, it was much more satisfying a professional experience than his years of nondescript military service. 3 months after returning to Washington, Johnston rejoined the Army, this time joining the newly formed Corps of Topographical Engineers, and got the rank of first lieutenant, and quickly after that got a brevet promotion to captain. Although that year out of the Army paved the way for his turn to the Topographical Engineers, it resulted in officers his junior in the academy ranking higher than him. Nevertheless, that year away from soldiering convinced Johnston that his proper place was in the Army. During the 1830s, Abingdon, Virginia felt much less like home to Johnston. His father passed away in 1831. His brother Charles and his wife drowned in the Potomac River traveling from Alexandria to Washington, D.C., and his oldest brother John passed away. What was left of the family in Abingdon now moved away, most of them to South Carolina. Even the family slaves were sold off to pay debts. So, when Johnston went home after 1838, it was usually to Columbia, South Carolina. As part of the Corps of Topographical Engineers, Johnston would be dispatched all over the country, with a surveying excursion in 1838 to New York, then back to South Florida for the winter. In 1839, the Army sent him to the newly admitted state of Michigan to survey the border between the United States and Canada. He made it to Detroit in July. He was to survey the country between Lake Huron and Lake Superior, north of the Straits of Mackinac, and choose locations for fortifications. Johnston and the other surveyors spent the summer surveying, then went back to Washington to draw the corresponding maps. One of the men on this journey was 2nd Lieutenant Robert McLean. The two grew close on their expedition, even though they were opposite in characteristics, Johnston being more reserved than the outgoing McLean. Over Christmas, McLean, whose family home lay not far from the capital on the Chesapeake in Maryland, invited Johnston to spend the holidays there. Johnston gladly came to the 2-story brick mansion called Bohemia, where he was introduced to McLean's family, including his 18-year-old sister, Lydia, who everyone called Lyd. For all of Johnston's aloofness to love, he confessed to one of his friends that, "You are a bachelor because insensible to such charms as furnish my life with its little share of happiness, while I, on the contrary, am so vastly susceptible as to face the influence of every female fascination between the St. Lawrence and the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi, and the Atlantic. So many attractions operating in different directions neutralize each other, of course, and they can't operate together, you know, because polygamy is contrary to the statute." For Johnston, who fell half in love with every pretty woman he met, Lydia became the woman he felt he could fall completely in love with, but he did not act immediately. In the spring of 1842, he went to survey Sackett's Harbor in New York, then back to Washington for the winter. In the winter of 1842, Johnston went back to Florida, all the while communicating with Lydia. It may have been because he didn't feel financially stable enough to start a family, or it may have been the age discrepancy, with Johnston being 15 years older than Lydia. Nevertheless, he continued the romance during his many expeditions. In Florida, Johnston was made the Assistant Adjutant General under General William Worth. Worth decided not to attempt to engage with the Seminoles, but burn their towns and destroy their crops as a way to wage war against the tribe. Johnston would say of Worth, "General Worth is my earliest admiration as a military man, and has always shown the kindest disposition for me, and his family is such a one as nobody else can boast of. These things together make the position of adjutant general more agreeable in his staff than that of any other general. While in Florida, one of Johnston's nephews, who was attending West Point, wrote to him, accusing his uncle of being a ladies' man while on these expeditions. Johnston wrote back, No, women are pleasant and attractive creatures beyond denial when one has nothing else to think of or to excite him, but those who believe such a story know me little. There are not, never were, women enough in the world to allure me from the chance of one hostile shot. He stayed in Florida only a short time, then headed back to Washington where he could make regular visits to Lydia. After a year, they would become engaged. Lydia was now 23, and Johnston was 38. They married on July 10, 1845, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland. One of Johnston's biographers wrote, As distant as he often seemed to others, as formal and precise as he was to strangers, Lydia was the one person with whom he shared all his private hopes and terrors. Theirs was a relationship that grew slowly and ripened fully over many years. Their correspondence brimmed with affection, even passion. The publicly restrained Johnston concluded his letters to his wife with, Good night, my love, my life, my soul. Lydia's sweetness was a perfect counterpoint to her husband's occasional irritability. One contemporary commented that Lydia supplied many of the qualities in which he was so lacking, and that she did more to keep him out of hot water and smooth over the rough places than anybody else in the world. The year after Johnston's marriage to Lydia, the U.S.-Mexico border dispute erupted in a war between the two nations, with the United States mobilizing its small army and recruiting volunteers to bolster the ranks. General Winfield Scott, whom Johnston had served under previously, formed up his staff, which included Johnston and other men who would play significant roles in Johnston's future. The staff included Robert E. Lee, Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard from Louisiana, George McClellan, and George Gordon Meade. Scott would lead an invasion of Mexico starting at Veracruz. Johnston traveled by steamer to New Orleans. The whole time he suffered horribly from seasickness. He shared a cabin with Lee, who was unaffected by the movement of the vessel. From there they traveled to the mouth of the Rio Grande, and by March 5th Johnston arrived off the coast of Veracruz. Soldiers landed on March 9th, and by March 10th Johnston, Scott, and the rest of the staff made landfall, to the great relief of Johnston, whose seasickness debilitated him while on board the vessel. The Mexican defenders gave up ground easily and quickly, allowing the U.S. troops to establish a beachhead and then cut the city of Veracruz off from the land with the army and from the sea by the Navy. Scott sent a letter to the Mexican governor of Veracruz asking for surrender. Johnston carried the letter to Juan Morales at 2 p.m. on March 22nd, bearing a white flag. The governor wrote out a polite but firm response that he couldn't surrender the city, and it was handed to Johnston, who took it back to Scott. Scott's artillery opened on the city on March 24th, and by the next day Morales escaped by boat out of the city. On the 26th, the Mexican people hung a white flag over the walls of the city. Johnston and Lee took part in the surrender ceremony. Scott wasted no time pushing inland to get away from the Mexican coast and the yellow fever that would soon break out. In the van of the army was Brigadier General David E. Twiggs' division, and accompanying the division was Johnston. Scott used his engineers also as scouts because of their superior knowledge of terrain. When Twigg and Johnston got to Cerro Gordo, the location of the Mexican army under Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Twigg sent Johnston and another officer forward to examine the Mexican position. When the two men got close, the Mexican artillery opened up, and Johnston was hit by a piece of grape shot, severely wounding him. He was brought to the village of Plan del Rio. While in a makeshift hospital, Johnston had to endure the disgusting and inappropriate comments of a volunteer officer. Johnston suffered in silence until the officer told his servant to go steal a baby goat from a herd being shepherded by the hospital. The dignified Johnston finally said something to the coarse man. If you dare to do that, I'll have you court-martialed and cashiered or shot. Johnston remained at the hospital for 2 weeks before being able to rejoin the army as it marched inland. The wounds weren't life-threatening, and his courage brought him a promotion to brevet lieutenant colonel, bypassing the rank of major. The higher rank meant that he would leave Scott's staff, but he would be a part of one of the regiments recruited in the United States and sent to the front in Mexico. Johnston had to wait for his new command to arrive in August. He would be the lieutenant colonel of a new type of unit composed of riflemen and dubbed light infantry, called voltigeurs. Soon the American army moved out from Puebla. Within the army was Johnston's nephew Preston, recently graduated from West Point. The two became even closer due to their close proximity in the invading army. The American army descended the mountains into the valley containing the Mexican capital, Mexico City. Johnston, in the division commanded by Percifer Smith, was ordered to cross the lava beds on the American right in order to secure the road leading to the capital. The division crossed the hazardous terrain and found they were nearly surrounded by Mexican forces. Smith planned an attack and sent Robert E. Lee through the lava beds to inform Scott of the planned assault and to ask for a simultaneous assault on the American left to fully rout the Mexicans. The 6 a.m. attack worked, and the two wings of the American army crushed the Mexican position. As the two halves of the army met in the Mexican entrenchments, the comrades began to shake each other's hands and congratulate one another on the stunning victory. Johnston spied Lee and went up to shake his hand. Lee's eyes began to well up with tears as he grabbed Johnston's hand and told Johnston that the night before, while manning his cannon, Preston was killed. Days later, Johnston would write, "I have never known the full bitterness of grief. Nobody else could love him as I have done. He was the pride of my heart, and I'll look to him for stay and comfort in declining years. I cannot tell you the bitterness of this event." The army moved on toward the capital. Johnston took part in the Battle of Molino del Rey, guarding the American left flank against Mexican cavalry, and then joining the main assault that saw the Americans fight house to house. Johnston won great praise for his bravery in those attacks. The next obstacle in the way of the Americans was the fortified military academy of Chapultepec. Johnston was to lead the main assault, with 4 companies of the Voltigeurs taking the southern gate and advancing halfway up the hill toward the citadel. Once halfway up, the assault party, armed with ladders, would pass through them and take Chapultepec. Not to miss out on the battle, Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard joined the Voltigeurs in their attack. As the riflemen waited for the men with ladders to pass through them, they were subjected to a horrendous volume of musketry, but it wasn't accurate. Many of the Mexican soldiers, to avoid exposing themselves, just placed their weapons over the walls and fired blindly, but it was enough to pin down the Americans. Beauregard, during this critical point, called out to Johnston, "Colonel, what will you bet on this shot?" Johnston immediately caught the spirit of the question and called back, "Drinks in the city of Mexico." Beauregard thereupon fired, and whether or not his bullet found its mark, he called back to Johnston, "You have lost. You'll have to pay it." When the assault party with ladders made it to Johnston's line, they hesitated. Taking the initiative, Johnston led both his troops and the other soldiers over the walls, capturing the ramparts of Chapultepec and the citadel. For his gallantry during the battle, he was given another promotion. Next, Johnston took another prominent role in the attack on Mexico City, helping to capture the capital and put it under American control. The occupation of the city was fairly dull service. Johnston presided over court-martials and attempted to keep the peace between the American soldiers and the Mexican civilians. The war was essentially over, and the most difficult moment was the loss of his nephew. Preston's parents had drowned in the Potomac River, and he had been orphaned. Family had took him and his sister in, and his Uncle Joe had looked after him from afar and been a constant companion in the young man's life. Decades later, Johnston still grieved over the young man's death. The end of the Mexican War brought with it vast amounts of land now under the control of the United States, and Johnston envisioned a great empire stretching deep into Mexico and controlling most of the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. Being a topographical engineer and a soldier, he salivated at the thought of exploring this territory and putting it on a map. He wrote to a friend, "I can't help building castles in the air." With this new accumulation of land, politicians and businessmen, north and south, wanted to link it together by rail, forming a transcontinental railroad. Some favored a northern route from Chicago to California, others from St. Louis to California, and some a southern route from Vicksburg to California. Johnston's commander, Colonel James Abert, was a strong ally of the southern route through Texas, and when Congress appropriated $50,000 for surveys through various territories and states, including Texas, Abert assigned Johnston the role of surveying a possible route for the railroad from San Antonio to El Paso. With a company of soldiers and 20 civilian laborers, Johnston cut a road from San Antonio to El Paso, arriving there in September. By the time the group made it back to San Antonio, it was November. Johnston got the railroad fever when a group of businessmen from the east wanted to hire him to survey for the San Antonio and Rio Grande Railroad. The deal fell through, only lasting a winter, so Johnston spent most of 1852 in Texas performing his military duties. In the fall of that year, he received a year's extended leave, spending most of that time in Baltimore with Lydia. When his year was over, he was assigned to supervise river improvements on the Arkansas, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers, He became seriously ill in the spring of 1854, sweating out a fever in Little Rock, Arkansas. He used his ill health to get reassigned to Washington. While there, word spread throughout the Army that Secretary of War Jefferson Davis was pushing for more regiments to add to the Army, and this posed a great opportunity for Johnston to rise up in rank because the topographical engineers had limited possibilities in promotion. In 1855, the new regiments were formed, and the officers were announced. Johnston was disappointed that he wasn't given command of one of the regiments, but he was put in second in command of the 1st United States Cavalry Regiment, with Edwin Sumner being its commander. Albert Sidney Johnston got command of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, and Robert E. Lee became that regiment's second in command. Again, Johnston and Lee's military careers were paralleling. The regiment would be stationed at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Johnston didn't care for his superior, thinking that he was too accustomed to the old ways of doing things and not willing to adapt to situations. He wrote about Sumner, "You have yet to learn how ignorant a man can keep himself who relies for knowledge upon experience and yet never observes or remembers." Another time he wrote, "The best opinions an officer of this regiment can cultivate are, that is to say for his own comfort, that he is utterly ignorant professionally, and that his colonel is not. The last most difficult." One of the regiment's first assignments was to put down an uprising of Sioux in the Wyoming Territory. The column rode out for several hard weeks to Fort Laramie, only to find the crisis was over, and they were returned to Fort Leavenworth. Johnston was appalled that the regiment lost 70 horses during the expedition, an occurrence he attributed to Sumner's inability or ignorance in taking care of their mounts. Sumner made Johnston's life miserable in the 1st Cavalry. The only redeeming quality was that Lydia was there to greet him home every evening, and the friendships he had cultivated. A young captain named George B. McClellan was taken under Johnston's wing, and the two became very close. Even Lydia enjoyed McClellan's company. Most of the time, Johnston's letters to McClellan would end with "Mrs. J. sends her love." The two joked with one another all the time. McClellan one time joked that an efficient commander would issue women right along with horses to the soldiers. Johnston responded that another officer is charmed with your notion of assimilating allowances of women and horses, and flatters himself that his chances of applying those principles are pretty fair, as there is a suspicion prevailing that we shall be sent to Utah next summer. When McClellan resigned from the Army, Johnston wrote to him, "Nothing since the 14th of August, '47, the day Preston died, has grieved me so much. It has overturned many castles in the air. On the subject of professional daily talks, reading, fencing, marches, and coffee talks, chases of buffalo, wolves, and Indians, there is no one left in the regiment or army to take your place. I wish I was young enough to resign too." The 1st Cavalry was called into action as the violence in Kansas over the issue of slavery became widespread. The pro-slavery governor of the territory was under orders from President Franklin Pierce that the anti-slavery legislature wasn't to meet, and called in the 1st Cavalry to prevent it from taking place. Johnston was part of that group who tried to keep the peace between the civilians, a task he felt beneath the regiment. Edwin Sumner, the regiment's commander, became the scapegoat when political backlash over not letting the anti-slavery legislature meet hit the governor and the president. Sumner was removed from command, even though he was just following orders. Johnston was overjoyed that Sumner was gone, and one of his Mexican War commanders was put in his place, Percifer Smith. Johnston was soon sent eastward to Jefferson Barracks, just outside of St. Louis, but he would be called back to Kansas to survey the southern border of the proposed state. Violence had prevented the survey from taking place any earlier. The survey expedition was a large one, with Johnston commanding 4 cavalry companies and 2 infantry companies under the command of Captain Richard Brooke Garnett. Johnston requested no new recruits were to be on this expedition, but when he got to Fort Leavenworth, the majority of his force were green troops, some of them never been in the saddle. He described the situation to McClellan. Fully 120 boobies who never straddled a horse, starting on an expedition of nearly 2,000 miles with a chance of getting into an occasional skirmish with the best horsemen in the world. The expedition laid the cornerstone for the southeast corner of Kansas and then headed west over 400 miles, crossing the Neosho and Arkansas rivers. At one point they were approached by a band of Osage. The interaction was friendly enough, each side trading goods back and forth, but the Osage became disgruntled when Johnston's men had no tobacco to spare in a trade. The only attack they suffered was by some Kiowa who stole one wagon and killed its wagon master. Pursuit of the culprits yielded no result. After laying the cornerstone for the southwest corner of Kansas, they began their trip back to Fort Leavenworth. Since the end of the Mexican War, politicians and businessmen, particularly Southerners, were land-hungry to expand slavery into the Southwest and build an empire for the United States. Santa Anna had been ousted and two governments ruled over Mexico, one in Mexico City and the other in Veracruz, with Benito Juarez as its president. The United States hoped to buy more land from Mexico and sought to entice either of the Mexican governments to relinquish the land if the United States recognized them as the official government of Mexico. Robert McLean, Johnston's brother-in-law, was sent as the minister of Mexico to declare which government to be legitimate. Johnston traveled to Mexico with him. Previous to his journey, Johnston, McClellan, and other Army officers discussed the possibilities of obtaining the northern half of Mexico and what that would mean for them and the country. Johnston was hopeful for expanded business ventures in the newly acquired territory, but when he and Robert arrived at Veracruz, Juarez was less than supportive of handing over land to the United States, even for recognition and money. Johnston's hopes were dashed, and he and Robert returned to Washington. In the spring of 1859, Johnston was made the Inspector General of the New Mexico Territory. Throughout the 1850s, Johnston had been in a battle over his appropriate rank. While he served in the post-Mexican War Army, Johnston was a lieutenant colonel, but Johnston believed he deserved the rank of colonel. During the Mexican War, he received two brevet promotions. The first one came at Cerro Gordo, which moved him from captain to lieutenant colonel, skipping over the rank of major. For his efforts in capturing Mexico City, he received another brevet promotion. Johnston believed the natural step would be to colonel, but the War Department and the Secretary of War, William L. Marcy, asserted he was only a lieutenant colonel because he entered the war as a captain, and two promotions would raise him to lieutenant colonel, not colonel. The Senate approved the Secretary of War's decision. In 1855, Johnston appealed his case again to someone he believed would sympathize, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Davis refused to reopen the case, stating that his predecessor had already ruled on it. Davis went further and stated that Johnston didn't serve as a lieutenant colonel during the campaign in Mexico, despite the official register of officers listing Johnston as a lieutenant colonel after Cerro Gordo. This would be the first disagreement between the two men. In 1857, President James Buchanan appointed John B. Floyd as the Secretary of War. Floyd had adopted Johnston's niece and nephew, Preston and Lizzie, after their parents had drowned. He was also the brother-in-law of one of Johnston's nephews. In a clear demonstration of nepotism, Floyd rejected the previous report and Senate decision and overturned them, making Johnston a colonel. Some of Johnston's comrades saw the promotion for what it was, nepotism. Robert E. Lee wrote to his brother that, "I think it must be evident to him that it never was the intention of Congress to advance him to the position assigned him by the Secretary." Johnston and Lydia traveled to McClellan's wedding in May 1860, and upon Johnston's return to Washington, he learned that General Thomas Jessup, the Quartermaster General of the Army for years, had passed away. That office was now vacant. Although Winfield Scott, as commander of the Army, was to choose Jessup's successor, Scott recommended 4 men to the Secretary of War for the Secretary to choose. On that list was Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, Charles F. Smith, and Joseph E. Johnston. Floyd chose Joe Johnston, and he became Quartermaster General of the Army with the rank of Brigadier General, the first graduate of West Point to obtain the rank of general in the regular army. As Quartermaster General, Johnston oversaw the feeding and equipping of the United States Army, working with a large budget of somewhere over $7 million. However, as he settled into his new job, the country was beginning to tear itself apart. Abraham Lincoln had been elected in November 1860, and now, at least one southern state made plans to hold a secession convention. Although his family owned slaves, Johnston himself wasn't a strong defender of slavery, but he also didn't see a world where whites and blacks could coexist in the same country without slavery. Years later, he wrote, "I often tried to convince them that the division of the country would give the slaves of the border southern states so near and safe a refuge that those states would soon cease to have slaves and be compelled to abandon the Confederacy." As one of Johnston's biographers stated, as Quartermaster General, Johnston's dilemma was a professional one. He presided over the nation's storehouses of war material, and as the likelihood of civil war grew, he found himself in an increasingly delicate position. Southern by birth, Union by profession, he sought to meet all his obligations honorably, but determining what those obligations were was often difficult. The fact that Johnston's boss, Secretary of War Floyd, was also a Virginian made it even more difficult. Unlike Johnston, Floyd had no qualms about slavery or the importance of defending it. Not only did he show doubtful loyalty to the government he served, he was so casual in his record-keeping that before the year was out, he would be the object of a congressional investigation. Floyd, in an open effort to get samples or patterns for war material to Southern states preparing to leave the Union, asked Johnston to send sample equipment to the governor of Georgia. Johnston sent some of the requested equipment, but not all. Within 2 weeks, Floyd had resigned and headed to Virginia to stir up secession in the state. Floyd's resignation caused a great deal of anxiety to Johnston. Friends could regularly find him pacing, deep in thought, and had a difficult time getting his attention as he stressed over the situation. One of Johnston's biographers summarized Johnston's beliefs during the crisis when he stated, "Johnston was not a proponent of slavery, and he doubted that secession was a legal right guaranteed by the Constitution, but he did believe in the right of revolution as a natural consequence of the principle of free government proclaimed by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Every government, Johnston believed, was founded on the consent of the governed, and every community strong enough to establish and maintain its independence has a right to assert it." Secession was not merely a philosophical question for Johnston. For all of his agonizing, one thing was clear from the outset: his strongest loyalty was to Virginia, and he would serve his state in any way that he could. If Virginia remained in the Union, so would Johnston. If she left, Johnston would leave with her. Johnston followed the secession debate in Virginia closely, mainly because his brother was a delegate to the convention and kept him apprised of the debates. His brother was a Unionist, and as long as the secessionists stayed in the minority, he told Joe to stay in the U.S. Army. But as soon as the tide began to turn when Fort Sumter was fired upon, he signaled to Joe that secession was inevitable in Virginia and even voted to leave the Union when it appeared hopeless to stay in it. Joe Johnston waited a few days after the news of Virginia's secession before heading to the War Department on the morning of April 22, 1861, just like he did every morning, but this time he carried a letter of resignation. Outside Secretary of War Simon Cameron's office, Johnston ran into Adjutant General Samuel Cooper. He asked Cooper to go in with him when he told the Secretary of his decision. Johnston was in tears when he said, "I must go with the South. I owe all that I am to the government of the United States. It has educated me and clothed me with honor. To leave the service is a hard necessity, but I must go." With his head bowed to hide his tears, Johnston left the room and went to tell Lydia the news. The two left their Alexandria home and boarded a train for Richmond the next day. They arrived in Virginia's capital on April 25th. Johnston sought out Virginia's governor, John Letcher, and offered his services to him. Robert E. Lee arrived 4 days earlier than Johnston and had been given the rank of Major General in command of Virginia's forces. On the recommendation of Lee, Letcher offered Johnston the same rank with control of Virginia's forces in and around Richmond. Johnston immediately accepted. For 2 weeks, Johnston busied himself with organizing troops as they came to the capital. However, the state of Virginia decided that they didn't need 2 major generals and offered Johnston a brigadier generalcy. Weeks before he resigned from the U.S. Army, Secretary of War for the Confederacy, with its capital in Montgomery, Alabama, offered Johnston the rank of brigadier general in the Confederacy. When Virginia backed out of the major general's rank, Johnston realized that the war effort would be conducted by the Confederacy and not the individual states, and left with Lydia for Montgomery. Johnston became a brigadier general in the Confederacy, having long discussions with the provisional president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. He made it known that he desired a field command in Virginia, and the Secretary of War, Pope Walker, and the President obliged, sending him to Harper's Ferry to take command of the troops there. He left Lydia in Montgomery and headed for Virginia on May 22nd. Johnston arrived with his staff at Harper's Ferry. Among his staff was Colonel Edmund Kirby Smith and Major William Henry Chase Whiting, both future Confederate generals. When he arrived, he notified the senior colonel among the 9 regiments, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, that he would now take command of all the forces at Harper's Ferry. Jackson, a colonel of Virginia State Forces, didn't recognize Johnston's rank from the Confederate government, and it was not until Whiting showed Jackson that Robert E. Lee had signed off on the transfer of state troops to the Confederate government that Jackson relinquished his troops. Johnston wasn't the only general in Virginia commanding Confederate troops. Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard had a large force around Manassas Junction. The garrison at Harper's Ferry seemed to Johnston very vulnerable, and it was. Without a significant force to occupy the heights around the town and to watch the various crossings of the Potomac River, Johnston's force was susceptible to encirclement and capitulation. Johnston sent off multiple messages to Richmond asking for reinforcements and for outright orders to evacuate Harper's Ferry. Although reinforcements would trickle in, the order to evacuate didn't come. Lee and Samuel Cooper, the same man who accompanied Johnston into Simon Cameron's office to resign, both informed him that he could withdraw from Harper's Ferry, but only at his discretion. Johnston didn't like that wording. He wanted the responsibility of the evacuation to be placed on the Confederate War Department, not himself. Finally, in mid-June, Johnston ordered the abandonment of Harper's Ferry, pulling his regiment south toward Winchester, Virginia, the true gateway to the Shenandoah Valley, according to Johnston. Once the evacuation got into motion, Johnston received an official statement from Samuel Cooper to abandon Harper's Ferry if he deemed it necessary. Johnston detected rebuke in the message, and he wrote back to Cooper, defending himself against this official criticism, which he felt slighted over. While near Winchester, Johnston formed his newly dubbed Army of the Shenandoah into 5 brigades, one under Jackson, another under the West Point trained Bernard B., another West Pointer named Arnold Elzey from Maryland commanded the 3rd Brigade. Francis Bartow was the only brigade commander in Johnston's command not trained at West Point. He was a Georgia planter, a Yale graduate, and a Confederate congressman until he resigned to become a colonel. When Edmund Kirby Smith was promoted to brigadier general, Johnston formed newly arriving troops into a brigade for his former staff member. Jeb Stuart, a young cavalier and former member of the 1st U.S. Cavalry like Johnston, commanded Johnston's cavalry. Johnston thought a lot of Jackson, A.P. Hill, who commanded the 13th Virginia in his army, and Stuart, complimenting the three repeatedly, especially Stuart. At a little after midnight on July 18th, Cooper sent a telegram to Johnston alerting him of a Federal army attacking Beauregard near Manassas Junction. Beauregard was outnumbered, so Johnston needed to bring his entire force to Beauregard's assistance. The Army of the Shenandoah would slip away from the Federal force in its front, thanks to the screening done by Stuart's cavalry. The army moved slowly, especially compared to the regular army troops Johnston had been accustomed to over his decades in the military. He decided to board them on trains destined for Manassas, but the rail cars arrived sporadically. Jackson's brigade was headed to Beauregard by noon on July 19th, but the bulk of the force didn't move until the 20th. Johnston arrived in Manassas at noon on the 20th and went to see Beauregard. Before leaving the Shenandoah Valley, Johnston telegraphed Jefferson Davis asking who was in command when the armies linked up, Beauregard or himself. When he arrived at Beauregard's headquarters, the telegram was answered. Johnston was in command. Despite his seniority, Johnston gave Beauregard great leeway in the battle since Beauregard knew the terrain and the bulk of the force at Manassas was Beauregard's Army of the Potomac. When the engagement opened on July 21st, sounds of battle were emanating from the north at Matthews Hill, but Beauregard was convinced that the main attack would come on his right, that the sounds of battle to the left was just a feint for the real attack. The hours passed and the sounds to the north grew louder. The worried Johnston made up his mind. The battle is there, and I am going, he said as he mounted his horse and told his staff to join him on the left. On top of Henry House Hill, he joined Jackson's brigade, perched atop the elevation and watched as Union troops began to advance. He knew that the line needed to be bolstered to stop the Union advance and noticed a group of men to the right and behind Jackson's brigade. It was the 4th Alabama Regiment. Most of its officers were killed or wounded, and they were without a leader. Johnston rode up to the unit, put his hand on the flag, and said to the color bearer, "Sergeant, hand me your flag. I will lead you. Follow me." The sergeant replied, "General, don't take my colors from me. Tell me where to carry them, and I will place them there." Johnston let go of the flag and led the regiment to Jackson's right. Bernard B's brigade was being torn apart by Federal bullets, and B himself rode up to Johnston with tears in his eyes, saying, "General, my command is scattered, and I am alone." Johnston replied, "I know it was not your fault, General B, but don't despair. The day is not lost yet." Looking over to a disordered group of men, Johnston asked who they were. B replied, "They are South Carolinians." Johnston ordered B to rally them and lead them back into the fight. B rode off and urged the men back into the fight, telling them to imitate the Virginians and Jackson, standing like a stone wall. It was during his stay on Henry House Hill that Beauregard informed Johnston that as the commander of all the forces, he should leave the sections of the battle to subordinates like himself. Johnston would agree to the suggestion and made his headquarters at the house of Francis W. Lewis. behind the lines and directed reinforcements to the Confederate left, sometimes taking them personally to the front and sometimes ordering an aide to place them. The Union troops finally broke, and as Johnston stated, the right of the Federal Army fled in wild confusion from the field toward Sudley Ford, while the center and left marched off hastily by the turnpike toward Centerville. Johnston tried to organize a pursuit, but the battle that sent the Union into a retreat also exhausted the Confederates and disorganized them. So, although some units were able to pursue, a total pursuit didn't materialize. Davis arrived at Johnston's headquarters as the sun was setting and asked how the battle went. Johnston said it was a victory, and Davis was thrilled. Davis, Johnston, and Beauregard rode over the battlefield and then went to Beauregard's headquarters. Davis, after getting details of the battle, ordered a pursuit, then changed his mind to order a reconnaissance in force for the next morning. The battle was the first major victory for the Confederacy, but it was a defeat to the reputation of Johnston. Beauregard, who was at Henry House Hill riding up and down the lines shouting encouragement to the troops, became famous and was touted in the newspapers as the man who won the Battle of Manassas. Although it didn't come immediately, other criticism, when the war was going against the Confederacy, lashed out at Johnston for not mounting a pursuit of the Federal Army. Johnston spent a great deal of time, especially in the post-war era, refuting these claims. In reality, a pursuit wasn't possible with the Confederates just as badly organized as the Federals, and even if they did get to Washington, it would be doubtful they could attack and capture the capital. As one of Johnston's biographers explained, as the relationship between Davis and Johnston soured in the coming months and years, each man tended increasingly to blame the other for past failures. The next few months after the First Battle of Manassas was a seminal moment for Johnston, for the worse. It created a toxic relationship between himself and the president, and it mostly stemmed over rank. Johnston was always touchy over rank and his authority. When orders arrived at his headquarters from Lee, he wrote them off as illegal since he outranked Lee in Confederate service. When Lee assigned Dabney H. Maury to Johnston's staff, Johnston fumed with anger that Lee would tell him what to do. He believed the only people he took orders from was the Adjutant General Samuel Cooper, the Secretary of War, and the President. What ruffled his feathers the most was a law put in place by the Confederate government outlining the rank designated in the Confederate Army. 3 laws were passed. The first ones were in March of that year, one outlining that there would be 5 brigadier generals in the Confederate service, and 2, their rank would be determined by their former commissions in the U.S. Army. So whoever was senior in the old Army was senior in the Confederate Army. Shortly after those laws were passed, they raised the rank from brigadier general to full general, with the same stipulations of seniority. Reasonably, Johnston believed he was the senior general in the Army. On August 31st, about 5 weeks after the First Battle of Manassas, Davis put forward 5 men to be named full generals in the Confederate Army to the Confederate Senate. Johnston was among those men on the list, but Davis based their seniority on their graduating class from West Point and their standing within the class. Thus, in Davis's list, Samuel Cooper, class of 1815, came first, followed by Albert Sidney Johnston, class of 1826, then Robert E. Lee, who had graduated second in the class of 1829, then Johnston, who graduated 13th in that same class, and finally Beauregard, who had graduated in 1838. Davis later explained his rankings by claiming that since Lee and Johnston, among others, had entered state service before accepting commissions in the Confederate Army, the congressional legislation did not apply to them. Still later, he claimed that Johnston's commission as a brigadier general in the old Army was a staff rank and therefore did not count. Whatever his real reasons, he chose to interpret the legislation in his own way. The list and the seeming demotion in Johnston's eyes offended him greatly and cut him to the quick, signaling an attack on his public honor and reputation. He wrote a scathing letter to the president saying, "I now and here declare my claim that notwithstanding these nominations by the president and their confirmation by Congress, I still rightfully hold the rank of first general in the armies of the Southern Confederacy. The ranking seeks to tarnish my fair fame as a soldier and a man, earned by more than 30 years of laborious and perilous service. I had but this, the scars of many wounds, all honestly taken in my front and in the front of battle, in my father's revolutionary sword. It was delivered to me from his venerated hands, without a stain of dishonor. Its blade is still unblemished, as when it passed from his hand to mine. I drew it in the war, not for rank or fame, but to defend the sacred soil, the homes and hearths, the women and children, the men of my mother Virginia, my native South. Davis took the letter to a cabinet meeting and read it. He wrote a brief reply that characterized Johnston's actions as unbecoming and his statements as one-sided, but that was it. One of Johnston's biographers wrote, "Davis and Johnston never again corresponded with one another about this issue, nor did they speak of it when they met, but it was always there. Johnston never forgave Davis for the ranking, and Davis never forgave Johnston for his outburst. The seeds of a lifelong feud would flourish in the ensuing years until that feud defined their whole attitude toward one another." In late September, Davis came north to Fairfax Courthouse to meet with Johnston and his two corps commanders, Beauregard and Gustavus W. Smith. In the meeting between the four men, Davis wanted an offensive into the north and asked what Johnston needed to launch such a campaign. Smith said at least 50,000 men, but Beauregard and Johnston claimed they needed 60,000 men. The army, as it stood, only numbered around 40,000. Davis asked where those troops would come from to augment the army. Johnston suggested stripping Georgia and the Carolinas of all available troops, saying, "Success here in Virginia saves everything. Defeat here loses all." Davis couldn't pull those troops away and decided against an offensive that fall. Johnston pulled his army back to Centerville and settled in for the winter. However, also that fall, Johnston would have another run-in with the Confederate authorities, but not Davis. This time it was the Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, an ardent supporter of Davis. Johnston wanted to know if the War Department planned on contracting out building huts for the winter for the troops. Although Benjamin said that the responsibility was on Johnston, Benjamin dispatched two contractors to Johnston. The contractors spoke with Johnston and agreed to have the huts ready by December. However, as the contractors were outside Beauregard's headquarters, an unidentified major said that the troops could build the huts themselves. The contractors took this as an official statement and left for Richmond, both them and Johnston thinking the situation was handled. Things became heated between Johnston and Benjamin when the two accused one another of not fulfilling their end of the situation. However, the huge disagreement came when Davis wanted to make good the law giving the president the ability to accept regiments from different states and to appoint officers to command them. Davis interpreted this as meaning to place the regiments of each state into brigades to create state brigades and even state divisions if possible. So he ordered Johnston to reorganize the army, and Johnston delayed. Johnston argued that with the enemy so close he could never have the opportunity to brigade the various regiments into state brigades. Davis and Benjamin repeatedly asked him to do so, and Johnston kept saying the moment wasn't right. When Johnston's staffer, Chase Whiting, defended Johnston to Benjamin, Davis ordered Whiting away from Johnston and to be sent to the Shenandoah Valley with Stonewall Jackson. Davis would eventually relent, but it only caused more bad blood between the two men. Then, as enlistments were coming up over the winter, Davis and Benjamin sought to keep as many men in the army as possible by granting furloughs and individual transfers if soldiers would stay in the army. Instead of working through Johnston, Benjamin sent his own recruiters into Johnston's camps with furlough papers and undermined Johnston's authority. Johnston wrote to the president complaining of Benjamin's meddling, but the appeal had no effect. During that winter, another event depressed Johnston. Beauregard was transferred to the Western Theater. Johnston would divide the two halves of his army into three divisions, one under Gustavus W. Smith, another under James Longstreet, and the other under Daniel Harvey Hill. His army hadn't grown much, hovering around 40,000, but the Union Army, under Johnston's friend George McClellan, numbered around 100,000 men, and the spring campaign season was about to begin. On February 19, 1862, Johnston was in Richmond to meet with Davis and the cabinet. The meeting lasted 7 hours, where they mostly discussed moving the army closer to Richmond, since other troops could not be spared to come to Virginia. When the discussions ended, Johnston and the president came away with different ideas on what was agreed upon. Johnston thought the plan was to fall back as soon as practicable. Davis thought the plan was to hold on until it became absolutely necessary to withdraw. Later that night at a dinner party, Johnston was asked about Judah Benjamin, and the general declared that the Confederacy could never win with him as Secretary of War. On Johnston's way back to Centerville, he met an acquaintance who asked if it was true that the cabinet had discussed the evacuation of Centerville. Johnston asked where he heard the rumor, and he said from the wife of a cabinet member. Johnston fumed over the lack of secrecy and silently vowed to never trust Davis with military secrets. In early March, Jeb Stuart's cavalry notified the Army commander that there was a buildup of Union forces in their front, and Johnston concluded that this was the major movement by the Union Army of the Potomac. By March 13th, the Army was safely behind the Rappahannock River. This came as a surprise to Davis because Johnston, fearing a leak in the communications, didn't notify the President of the evacuation until it was already underway. Davis would make Robert E. Lee the conduit through which much of the military correspondence would flow from the President, and in such a position, Lee and Davis visited Johnston south of the Rapidan River. They discussed strategy, and Johnston wanted to give ground in order to concentrate his forces, but Lee wanted Johnston to engage with the enemy as far away from the strategic center as possible. When a buildup of Union forces began near Fort Monroe on the peninsula in Virginia, formed by the James and York Rivers, Davis and Lee wanted Johnston to divide his force and send a large portion to Richmond. Johnston obviously balked at the thought and suggested sending the whole army to Richmond. Eventually, they settled on about 10,000 troops. Johnston would warn, "We cannot win without concentration." By April, the Union Army under Johnston's friend George McClellan was on the peninsula, and Johnston's army was brought to Richmond. On April 14th, the discussion between Davis, Lee, Johnston, Hill, Longstreet, Smith, and the newly appointed Secretary of War George Randolph lasted hours as Johnston argued to withdraw to Richmond and fight a climactic battle outside the city. Lee and Davis wanted Johnston to engage with McClellan on the peninsula, where the Union's numbers were minimized by the small front they could occupy. Johnston grew concerned over the Union Navy possibly outflanking his position on land and defended himself vigorously. In the end, Davis and Lee ordered Johnston to fight it out on the peninsula. The stage was set for the Peninsula Campaign, pitting two friends and their armies against one another. Joseph E. Johnston rode with his army through the streets of Richmond, entering that capital city as the savior to the inhabitants who feared that the Union invasion up the peninsula would put them in direct danger. Crowds of men and women gathered to watch the army pass through. They threw their hats in the air and hollered themselves hoarse. A young man remembered the event, and specifically Johnston. He sat his mount as if he had been a part of her, a little bay mare that looked as if she had been specially built to carry him. They were perfectly matched in size, and her step was as proud as his bearing. His uniform from cap to spur, her housings from headstall to shabrack, were in exact conformity to Army regulations. The adulation paid him evidently pleased him. So also did it please the bay filly, whose crested neck, tossing head, cocked tail, and caracoling step made her seem conscious that she was bearing a Caesar and his fortunes. On the peninsula, George McClellan assembled his mammoth force of over 100,000 men. Johnston didn't plan on staying on the peninsula as President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee wanted. Johnston believed there was no possible way he could withstand the bombardment of heavy siege guns, and with rains beginning to set in, he worried about the possibility of a withdrawal. Every 2 or 3 days he would write to Davis and Lee informing them that he couldn't hold out on the line he then occupied. On April 30th, the first shells from the Union siege guns began to pepper the Confederate position. The next day, Johnston announced to his staff that they would withdraw. He wrote to Davis telling him about the movement, and when Davis replied that the retreat was a surprise, Johnston responded, "I determined to retire because we can do nothing here. The enemy will give us no chance to win. We must lose. By delay, we may ensure the loss of Richmond too. I have explained this to General Lee." The retreat of the Confederate troops would be miserable. On May 2nd, they began moving the wounded and their ammunition trains out of harm's way. Then the infantry would follow. Johnston gave specific instructions about the time and what road each division would take in the retreat, but some officers didn't obey orders, like Daniel Harvey Hill, who waited hours after his appointed time to get his wagons on the road. Pulling back the line to Williamsburg, Johnston found a home to make his headquarters. There, with his aides and Major Edward Porter Alexander, Johnston took off his jacket and discussed the retreat and the likelihood that they would have to fight back against cavalry probes. Johnston grabbed his saber and began to demonstrate the saber tactics for the men. Alexander said he had seen many of the most famous cavaliers, but had never seen a saber whistle and sing like that one. The retreat up the peninsula continued, and along the way Johnston came across a 12-pound Napoleon stuck in the mud. When the lieutenant of the piece surmised that they would have to leave the gun, Johnston said, "Oh no, I reckon not. Let me see what I can do." He waded out in the mire, seized one of the wheel spokes, covered as it was with mud, and called out, "Now, boys, all together." The effect was magical, and the next moment the gun jumped clear of the mud hole. Although Johnston kept Lee apprised of his movements, he sporadically informed Davis. Johnston kept pressing for a concentration of his forces to the outskirts of Richmond, meaning to bring Stonewall Jackson from the Shenandoah Valley and Richard Ewell from Fredericksburg, and any forces he could muster in North Carolina. Lee had other plans. Lee dispatched Ewell to Jackson and wanted Jackson to distract the other large Union army near Fredericksburg by operating offensively in the valley. Johnston was unaware of many of these communications, and thus never did know the entire situation as pertaining to all of the forces under his command. The interactions and disagreements between Davis and Johnston only made Johnston more irritable and made him lash out. On May 7th, Union gunboats on the York River landed a few thousand Union soldiers on the peninsula, threatening Johnston's left flank. Johnston told Gustavus Smith to send a brigade to fill out the enemy and then withdraw, pulling the Union troops away from the gunboats' protective guns. Smith assigned this task to John Bell Hood, who commanded a brigade of men. Hood, instead of pulling the Union soldiers away from the river, drove them to the river, coming out on the better end of the engagement. Johnston was furious at Hood going against orders. Johnston asked the young commander, "What would your Texans have done if I had ordered them to charge and drive back the enemy?" Hood replied, "I suppose, General, they would have driven them into the river and tried to swim out and capture the gunboats." Johnston didn't want to dampen Hood's enthusiasm, and although he was annoyed, smiled and said, "Teach your Texans that the first duty of a soldier is literally to obey orders." Johnston was more mad than he let on. He began to gallop away with his staff trying to catch up. Not to be outdone, Edward Port Alexander dug his spurs in and caught up to the general. Weaving in and out of the wagons and ambulances that blocked the road, Johnston kept up a great speed, and when an ambulance attempted to get out of the way of the riders, he inadvertently cornered the general and forced him to rein up his horse. Johnston was furious, cursing the man. He looked over to Alexander and said, "Give me a pistol, and let me kill this infernal blankety-blank." Alexander had to pretend not to have a pistol to save the man's life. The retreat continued, and during it, Davis and Lee met with Johnston to discuss strategy. Johnston outlined his plan. He would fight defensively until the Federals gave him an opening to launch an attack. By mid-May, McClellan was providing the opening. Johnston and his army had retreated all the way to the gates of Richmond, and McClellan was moving his army around, placing 2 corps across the Chickahominy River, while the rest of the army was on the other side of the river. This isolated group provided Johnston with the opportunity to launch his assault. Those Federal corps were dug in and around a crossroads known as 7 Pines because of the 7 loblolly pines that stood in a row at the crossroads. Johnston would assemble 3 divisions to attack the Federal corps, those under James Longstreet, D.H. Hill, and Benjamin Huger. Unfortunately for Johnston, his orders were vague, and when he issued orders to those division commanders, he didn't explain what their overall role was in the engagement, just what they would be doing, which led to confusion as to what would precipitate their own attacks. Johnston placed Longstreet in command of the engagement. Because of the vague orders, only a small fraction of the troops chosen to attack actually made an attack at all. After sending multiple staffers to search for Longstreet, one finally made it back to Johnston and reported that the battle was underway. It was now after 2:30, and to complete the battle plan, Johnston would personally lead Chase Whiting's division to slam into the Union right flank. However, the Confederate battle line under Longstreet wasn't where Johnston believed it to be, and so the reinforcements and attack didn't yield any great result. What did result was Confederate brigades assaulting a heavily fortified Union position and being thrown back. It was getting late, and Johnston decided to call off any more attacks and renew the assaults in the morning. Johnston was watching the battle wind down from atop a small rise when he noticed one of his staffers dodging bullets that were zipping past them. Johnston informed him with a smile, "Colonel, there is no use dodging. When you hear them, they have passed." Almost as soon as the words came out of his mouth, a bullet slammed into his shoulder. It was a minor wound, and Johnston didn't even dismount after it hit him. But then an artillery shell exploded nearby, and pieces of the projectile hit him in the chest and in the thigh. He fell hard from his horse, and many thought he had been killed outright. Then he was put on a litter and carried to a hospital. The muddy road made the soldiers carrying him slip and fall, dropping the wounded general, leading him to cry out every time a litter-bearer lost his footing. They carried him past the president, who bent down to address the wounded general. Johnston opened his eyes and grasped the president's hand. Davis asked if there was anything he could do. Johnston shook his head and said he didn't know how serious the wound was, but he thought that a shell fragment injured his spine. The litter-bearers continued taking the general to the rear, but Johnston was conscious enough to remember his pistols and his sword, especially his sword, which had been left on the field. One of his staffers, Drury Armistead, volunteered to go back and get them. When he returned with the pistols and sword, Johnston was so grateful he gave Armistead one of his pistols. With the general injured, Davis turned to Robert E. Lee and placed him in command of Johnston's army. Lee wouldn't renew the attacks, believing the opportunity was gone. Johnston would have been within reason to blame Longstreet for the lost opportunity, but Johnston never did blame him. He blamed Benjamin Huger, and Huger's military career suffered because of the criticism. Edward Porter Alexander still blamed Longstreet for the horrible delay and the misunderstanding of orders, saying that Longstreet's actions utterly wrecked and ruined Johnston's excellent and simple plan. However, ultimate blame goes to Johnston for his confusing orders and his inability to convey his orders to his subordinates. The reason that Johnston didn't blame Longstreet was probably because he was protecting him. As one of Johnston's biographers put it, Johnston even went so far as to ask Gustavus Smith to change his official report by omitting all references to Longstreet's movements. He acknowledged to Smith that his draft report contained references to subjects which I never intended to make generally known, specifically the misunderstanding between Longstreet and myself in regard to the direction of his division. He did not feel any difficulty in asking Smith to remove the offending passages, for, as he asserted, these matters concern Longstreet and myself alone. At the same time, Johnston publicly praised Longstreet for his skill, vigor, and decision during the battle, and endorsed Longstreet's criticism of Huger. Huger wrote to Johnston as he was convalescing in Richmond and demanded for Johnston to correct the errors in his report, criticizing his actions and allowing Longstreet to get away without taking any blame. Huger even asked the president to open up a court of inquiry so he could clear his name. Davis and Johnston allowed the situation to drop, and Huger never got his day in court. As one of Johnston's biographers stated, the Battle of Seven Pines went down in Confederate lore as a victory, an incomplete victory to be sure, but a victory nonetheless. It was not. Johnston had bungled a splendid opportunity. He had failed to communicate his plans adequately to his subordinates. He had failed to keep track of the developing battle, and after he had taken charge personally of the battle on the left, he had led his men into a hornet's nest. Worse than all these errors, in the coming weeks and months, he would falsify his written reports to shield a favored subordinate. G.W. Smith's final verdict was that there is but little to commend General Johnston's practical management of the Army May 31st, and the same may be said in regard to the accounts he has given on these events. Johnston was taken to a home in Richmond to get medical attention. The shoulder wound hadn't hit bone, and hit nothing vital, but the shrapnel to his chest broke multiple ribs. It would take months for him to recover. As he recuperated, he was visited by Texas Senator Louis T. Wigfall and his wife Charlotte. Charlotte waited in the carriage as the senator entered the home that acted as Johnston's hospital, and Lydia Johnston went out to sit with Charlotte. The two couples became fast friends as Wigfall frequently visited Johnston. They became such good friends that the Wigfalls invited the Johnstons to stay with them while Joe recovered. This would end up being another divide in the rivalry between President Davis and Johnston, because Wigfall was one of the outspoken members of the Confederate Congress against the president, and by moving in with Wigfall, it signaled to Davis that Johnston was solidly in the anti-Davis camp of the Confederate government. Because Johnston was associated with Wigfall, he became associated with two other anti-Davis politicians, Henry S. Foote of Tennessee and William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama. Foote, a former Unionist, and Yancey, a fire-eating secessionist, patched up their friendship, and a celebratory breakfast was held in honor of the reconciliation. About noon, with the party members gathered around drinking champagne ran through the blockade, Yancey told Johnston to remain seated. Then Yancey stood and said, "This toast is to be drunk standing. Gentlemen, let us drink to the health of the only man who can save the Confederacy, General Joseph E. Johnston." Johnston rose from his seat and said, "Mr. Yancey, the man you describe is now in the field, in the person of General Robert E. Lee. I will drink to his health." It was now November 1862, and Lee had beaten back McClellan from the gates of Richmond and struck north, delivering another victory at the Battle of Second Manassas. Then, following that victory, Lee invaded the north, fighting the Battle of Antietam. Although Antietam wasn't a victory for Lee, that general star was rising fast in the minds of most Confederates. On November 12, 1862, Johnston reported for active duty to the Secretary of War George Randolph, but where to put him? Lee's successes made taking over the Army of Northern Virginia impossible, but there were basically 4 armies operating west of the Appalachian Mountains: Edmund Kirby Smith in East Tennessee, Braxton Bragg with the Principal Field Army, also stationed in East Tennessee, John C. Pemberton in and around Vicksburg, and Theophilus Holmes in the Trans-Mississippi West. Johnston proposed that the Confederacy link Pemberton and Holmes together to give mutual support and combine the armies of Bragg and Smith. Johnston wrote up his suggestion and brought it to Randolph, who read the letter, then brought out another letter from himself saying the exact same thing. This signaled to Johnston that it wasn't the Secretary of War's policy keeping these armies separated, but Davis, who had decided against such a policy. Randolph would resign a few days later over the disagreements with Davis. On November 24, 1862, Johnston left Richmond for Tennessee and the Western Theater. He was to take command of all the armies between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, as far north as Kentucky and as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. He basically didn't have a command. It was his job to shuttle troops around the department as needed, but any command was better than no command to Johnston. One of Johnston's biographers explained the ambiguous situation. Davis and Samuel Cooper assumed that Johnston would exercise personal command of either Western army whenever he was present, but Johnston's sense of decorum, as well as his sense of justice, would not allow him to supersede an army commander. It would also require him to assume the day-to-day management of an army without having the day-to-day knowledge of its inner workings. Johnston's role in either army would be more like that of a visitor, at best an advisor, at worst a supernumerary. In addition to the confusion of command, army commanders sent the reports to Richmond, not Johnston. In reality, Johnston commanded nothing. Johnston was in Tennessee by December and found Bragg's Army of Tennessee encamped at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The Union Army of the Cumberland under William S. Rosecrans lay just 20 miles or so from there in Nashville. Johnston stayed a week with that army and then headed back to Chattanooga, where Lydia had set up house. Johnston was greeted by Davis, who came west to see the situation for himself. Pemberton in Mississippi was under dire straits as Ulysses S. Grant's forces began probing through Mississippi and down the Mississippi River. Davis wanted Pemberton reinforced, but Holmes in Arkansas had too few troops, and they were spread out over the state, keeping Arkansans from feeling as though they were abandoned by the Confederacy, and Davis was unwilling to order Holmes to send reinforcements. Johnston argued for Holmes to send troops, not Bragg, who was already outnumbered in Middle Tennessee. Davis and Johnston went to Bragg's army, and Davis was satisfied that the Union Army at Nashville would remain passive, so he sent around 10,000 men from that army to reinforce Pemberton, against Johnston's wishes. Davis and Johnston would travel to Vicksburg as Rosecrans moved his Army of the Cumberland out of Nashville to attack Bragg. The President and the General inspected Vicksburg and its defenses, then Davis made a speech in Jackson. On this journey together, Johnston tried to convince the President to unite Holmes and Pemberton to defeat Grant, because taking any more troops from Bragg threatened to lose all of Tennessee. When the Battle of Stone's River resulted in a Confederate defeat, Johnston's situation changed. Pemberton's position was secured by the victory at Holly Springs and sending Grant's forces back into Tennessee. But now Bragg retreated and was in a precarious situation if the Union Army pursued. Exasperated over the responsibility, but lack of authority, Johnston asked to be relieved of command twice, but Davis refused. The defeat at Stone's River riled up more anti-Bragg sentiment in the Army of Tennessee. Both of Bragg's corps commanders, Leonidas Polk and William Hardee, renewed their assertions that Bragg was unfit for command. Davis dispatched Johnston to the Army of Tennessee to see if the situation was as bad as they reported. This brought Johnston into a dilemma. His sense of honor wouldn't allow him to advocate for the removal of a general who he stood the best chance of replacing if that general was removed. He desired the position as commander of the Army of Tennessee, but his personal honor forbade him from advocating for Bragg's removal. He wrote to the President, I am glad to find that your confidence in General Bragg is unshaken. My own is confirmed by his recent operations, which, in my opinion, evince great vigor and skill. It would be very unfortunate to remove him at this juncture, when he has just earned, if not won, the gratitude of the country. Johnston approved of Bragg's conduct during the Battle of Stone's River, and probably blamed the loss on Davis's insistence that troops be sent from Bragg's command and sent to Vicksburg. Secretary of War James Seddon and Davis both asked Johnston to stay on as commander of the army, but employ Bragg as a chief of staff to spare Bragg the embarrassment of being entirely removed from the army. Johnston refused on the basis of his honor. Seddon and Davis argued with Johnston, saying, "I do not think your personal honor is involved, and make the sacrifice of your honorable delicacy to the importance of the occasion and the greatness of our cause." Johnston wouldn't remove Bragg. The position Johnston occupied in early 1863 was filled with boredom. He complained of doing next to nothing, and asked Wigfall if he could find him a better position. Although a change would mean moving to a different location, Lydia, always accompanying her husband, said to her friend Charlotte, "I am not sorry to go anywhere to be a little nearer him." Johnston envied Robert E. Lee's command and thought about scenarios that would bring him back in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He wrote to Wigfall, "I am told that the President and Secretary of War think they have given me the highest military position in the Confederacy. If they so regard it, might not our highest military officer to occupy it? It seems to me that principle would bring Lee here. I might then, with great propriety, be placed in my old command." When Johnston heard about Lee's victory at Fredericksburg, when Union General Ambrose Burnside flung troops against Lee's defenses, Johnston responded, "What luck some people have. Nobody will ever come to attack me in such a place." On March 9th, Davis called Bragg to Richmond for a consultation, and Johnston temporarily took command of the Army of Tennessee. But when Johnston arrived at Tullahoma, the winter camp of the army, Bragg informed him that he couldn't go to Richmond because Mrs. Bragg was sick. Johnston told him to postpone the trip, and a weird limbo state became the norm, as Bragg wasn't gone, but Johnston was basically in command. When Mrs. Bragg became well enough, Bragg prepared to go to Richmond, but Johnston became ill, suffering greatly from his wounds, which hadn't completely healed, and the constant travel irritated them. So Bragg remained with the army, as Johnston technically commanded from his sickbed. Johnston was again depressed at being placed as the commander of the Department of the West. His understanding of what a general should be was to lead armies at the front, not coordinate armies from a war room. That wasn't his style. For all of the criticism against Johnston's strategic and tactical visions, he was great at inspiring soldiers, like his time in Mexico and Florida, and at the Battle of First Manassas. This new way of conducting war did not mesh with his ideas of what warfare looked like. May 9, 1863 saw Johnston receiving an all-important telegram from Secretary of War James Seddon to report immediately to Mississippi and take command of the forces there. Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee was closing in on Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the Confederate garrison at the important Mississippi town needed all the help it could get. Johnston arrived at Jackson, Mississippi on May 13th. As soon as he arrived, he witnessed wounded soldiers being brought into the city from the fight the day before at Raymond. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers were on the east side of the river and pushing east toward Jackson. Johnston wired the Secretary of War to say, "I have arrived this evening, finding the enemy's force between this and General Pemberton, cutting off communication. I am too late." Johnston only possessed 6,000 men at Jackson, but he was expected to receive 5,000 more troops soon. He couldn't cut his way to Pemberton, but it was possible for Pemberton to cut his way to Jackson. Pemberton had around 30,000 troops combined, and if he linked up with Johnston, they stood a chance of fending off Grant's army, but Pemberton wouldn't comply. Historians have suggested that Pemberton's northern berth made people question his loyalty, and thus he felt he couldn't abandon the city because people would declare him a traitor to the South. Plus, Pemberton knew that Davis's orders to him the whole time he commanded in Mississippi was that he must hold Vicksburg at all hazards. Pemberton wouldn't give it up. Instead of attacking part of Grant's force, he moved south to cut Grant's supply line, disobeying Johnston's orders. In Jackson, Johnston prepared his defenses, and on May 14th, Grant attacked the city, extending his lines to overlap the flanks of the Confederate defenders. As the Confederate artillerymen kept up a continuous fire, Johnston pulled his troops out of the city and moved toward Canton, Mississippi. Grant didn't pursue. The Union conqueror slept in the same bed at the Bowman House Hotel that Johnston had slept in the night before, and no doubt slept better. Johnston now marched north of Jackson and away from Ulysses S. Grant's army, but he was still hopeful that he could connect with John C. Pemberton's army. Word got to Johnston that instead of linking up with him, Pemberton had moved south, and now Grant's army was getting in between the two Confederate forces. Grant defeated Pemberton's army at Champion Hill and at Big Black River Bridge. In Johnston's view, Pemberton's troops were more valuable to the Confederacy than the city of Vicksburg, and thus wanted Pemberton to evacuate it and bring his troops north. He wrote, "If you are invested at Vicksburg, you must ultimately surrender. Under such circumstances, instead of losing both troops and place, we must, if possible, save the troops. If it is not too late, evacuate Vicksburg and its dependencies and march to the northeast." Pemberton wrote in his official report that it meant the loss of the valuable stores and munitions of war collected for its defense, the fall of Port Hudson, the surrender of the Mississippi River, and the severance of the Confederacy. He informed Johnston, "I have decided to hold Vicksburg as long as is possible, with the firm hope that the government may yet be able to assist me. I still conceive it to be the most important point in the Confederacy." Troops from all over the South began coming to Johnston's command in an effort to end the siege of Vicksburg. In all, Johnston commanded about 23,000 men, still too small a number to engage with Grant, but Johnston's army was the one great hope for the city of Vicksburg. Davis wanted Johnston to cut his way into the city to save it, but Johnston knew that it would be a fool's errand. Grant heard the rumors and said, "If Johnston tries to cut his way in, we will let him do it, and then see that he don't get out." Johnston was back in Jackson after the Federals left the city to concentrate on Vicksburg. Johnston wired the president to send him more troops, and at one point Secretary of War James Seddon and President Jefferson Davis asked him why he didn't simply summon troops from Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. Johnston thought that when he was sent to Mississippi, he no longer had the authority of the commander of the Department of the West. Seddon and Davis both assured him that he had the power to call as many troops in the West to him as he needed, but this posed a serious dilemma to Johnston. Taking troops from Bragg meant giving up Tennessee. He would have to choose which state to save. He wrote to Seddon that, to take from Bragg a force which would make this army fit to oppose Grant would involve yielding Tennessee. It is for the government to decide between this state and Tennessee. Lydia, Johnston's wife, was in Columbia, South Carolina during this crisis in Mississippi. She would write to her husband that she feared he would be blamed for Vicksburg's capitulation. Johnston wrote back, "Don't be uneasy on that subject. If I do my best with insufficient means, it will soon be understood that those means are insufficient, and the judgment which will be passed by the Southern press should Vicksburg fall will be reversed. Remember how this Southern country condemned me for leaving Harper's Ferry, and how afterwards extolled me for it. One who discharges his duty manfully and unselfishly will always be respected, although he may not be thought a great man, and I assure you that to be the object of popular clamor is no wish of mine. The respect of the respected I do desire. Its admiration would be pleasant too." On July 3, 1863, Johnston sent a message to Pemberton asking him to attempt an escape and that he would create a diversion on July 7th. On July 5th, Johnston marched his men out of Jackson, aimed at the forces of William T. Sherman guarding the Big Black River. On the 7th, Johnston received word that on the 4th, Pemberton had surrendered. He never got Johnston's message. With Vicksburg captured, Johnston turned back to Jackson and set up defenses, wagering that the drought would prevent Grant from moving quickly, and even if the Federal army did make it to Jackson, the Union army wouldn't be able to besiege the city for lack of water and would attack the entrenchments established by Johnston. Unfortunately for Johnston, the skies brought rain, and Grant's forces concentrated on Jackson. Instead of holding out and ending up like Vicksburg, Johnston evacuated the city on July 16th, letting the Union capture it for the second time in about 2 months. As soon as Vicksburg capitulated, blame was thrown around throughout the Confederacy. Johnston blamed Pemberton, and Pemberton and Davis both blamed Johnston. Davis was upset that Johnston didn't link up with Pemberton immediately, and then blamed him for not fighting into the city once it was besieged. The Confederate chief of ordnance suggested to Davis that Vicksburg fell because of a want of supplies. Davis shot back, yes, from a want of provisions inside and a general outside who wouldn't fight. Pemberton felt that Johnston had abandoned him in the city. In late July, when Pemberton was paroled, Pemberton went to Johnston's headquarters near Morton, Mississippi, and as he approached the front porch, Johnston stood up with a smile and extended his hand, saying, "Well, Jack, old boy, I am certainly glad to see you." Pemberton didn't grab Johnston's hand. He simply saluted and then stated, "General Johnston, according to the terms of parole prescribed by General Grant, I was directed to report to you, sir." The two men stood there without saying a word, then Pemberton wheeled around and walked away. The two never met again. Also in July, Davis removed Johnston from command of the Department of the West and geographically hemmed him in by having him preside over Mississippi, southern Alabama, and parts of West Tennessee. Soon, a 15-page letter arrived to Johnston from Davis outlining that Johnston misunderstood his role in the Department of the West, that he was not taken out of that position when sent to Mississippi to help Vicksburg, as Johnston believed. Johnston could have taken this communication and acknowledged that there was a miscommunication, but he didn't. Johnston felt his honor had been besmirched. His response back and the subsequent letters from each of the men created political turmoil in the Confederacy. One of Johnston's biographers described it best when he stated, "Throughout the summer and fall, the personal feud was transformed into a political issue that threatened to tear the Confederacy apart. The dispute became a protracted guerrilla war of private letters, official reports, newspaper editorials, and backstage political intrigue that gathered momentum until it was national in scope and dominated political disputes in Richmond. Johnston would have denied that he was engaged in a political battle with the president. He would have explained that he was only defending his professional honor against an unjustified attack. Nevertheless, his willingness to accept the aid of Davis's foes made him a political player, whether he would admit it or not. The war of words sliced through the Confederacy, with its newspapers and its people quickly taking sides. Eventually, a court of inquiry was launched, and Johnston was summoned to Richmond. When he arrived, he found that the court had been indefinitely suspended. Those who got along best with Davis were men who were willing to subordinate their own views and personalities to the president, men like Judah Benjamin, Bragg, and Pemberton. Even Robert E. Lee became skilled in drafting the detailed, earnest letters that assuaged Davis's jealousy and suspicion. Johnston could not do it. He would have considered such behavior an abandonment of his professional responsibility, so he kept his own counsel, made his own decisions, and stood ready to bear the consequences. In effect, Johnston's concept of professional responsibility clashed with Davis's commitment to micromanagement. Because Johnston believed in the concentration of forces, when departments all over the Confederacy called for reinforcements, he obliged as much as he could, sending nearly half of his army from Mississippi to Braxton Bragg, bolstering it for the Battle of Chickamauga. Meanwhile, Johnston used what forces he did have for supporting Mobile, Alabama, and its defenses. From his headquarters in Mississippi, Johnston watched as the war was fought all around him, but didn't participate. Mississippi was now a backwater of the conflict. Bragg defeated William S. Rosecrans at the Battle of Chickamauga, then laid siege to the city of Chattanooga. With the help of Grant and the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland broke the siege and defeated Bragg at the battles of Lookout Mountain, Orchard Knob, and Missionary Ridge. It was a horrible defeat for Bragg, and one that he couldn't recover from. President Davis removed him from command at the end of 1863. Davis really only had two options within his group of full generals in the Confederacy: Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard and Johnston. Davis hated Beauregard more than he hated Johnston, and decided to bring Johnston out of Mississippi and placed him in charge of the Army of Tennessee. On December 27th, Johnston announced to the Army that he was their new commander. The Army commander began to inspect the camps of his new army. One soldier described the scene. "Fancy, if you please, a man about 50 years old, rather small of stature, but firmly and compactly built, an open and honest countenance, and a keen but restless black eye, that seemed to read your very inmost thoughts. In his dress he was a perfect dandy. He ever wore the very finest clothes that could be obtained, carrying out in every point the dress and paraphernalia of the soldier. His hat was decorated with a star and feather, and he wore a bright new sash, big gauntlets, and silver spurs. He was the very picture of a general." The men cheered their new general, just as much because now they wouldn't have to deal with Bragg. Johnston went about improving the daily lives of the men under his command. The army was stationed in northern Georgia at Dalton. He started by organizing the flow of supplies and food to the soldiers to keep them from having to eat rancid beef that the soldiers called blue beef. The men would also receive a twice-a-week ration of tobacco and whiskey, although somewhat temporary. He gave amnesty to those soldiers absent without leave to encourage them to come back to the ranks, and those men who stayed got long furloughs. These immediate changes in the administrative aspect of the army made the soldiers love Johnston. Johnston inherited an army that was divided over its commander, and although Johnston won over the lower ranks, he still needed to prove himself to the corps and division commanders. His two corps were commanded by William Hardee and John Bell Hood. Hardee was a mainstay of the Army of Tennessee, only leaving that army for a short while to operate in Mississippi under Johnston in the fall of 1863, missing the Battle of Chickamauga. Old Reliable, as they called him, temporarily commanded the Army of Tennessee, but did not want the job permanently. He thought, since he was the senior corps commander, that Johnston would hold counsel with him, but he was wrong. That, along with the rocky relationship in Mississippi, led neither man to fully trust the other. Johnston did confide in Hood, the Eastern Theater general who came west with James Longstreet just prior to Chickamauga. The maimed general became friends with Johnston, and it was Hood who Johnston held counsel with. Unfortunately for Johnston, Hood, as the young general was recovering in Richmond, became friends with the President and the First Lady. Hood attended church with Davis and spent hours flattering the commander-in-chief. When Hood came west to become Johnston's corps commander, Hood began sending letters back to the President, reporting on the inner workings of the army and providing him information about Johnston. At first, it appears that Hood liked Johnston and respected him, but at least one historian thinks that Hood's desire for higher command led him to criticize Johnston more and more as the months went by. One thing that confused Davis and angered Johnston was the perceived condition of the army. While Hardee commanded the army, he reported to Richmond that the men were fairly healthy and in good spirits, giving an overall good impression of the state of the Army of Tennessee. When Johnston took command, his reports were the exact opposite, telling the President that the men, weapons, and supplies were entirely insufficient to defend, much less launch an offensive as the President wanted. Davis wanted to retake portions of Tennessee, but Johnston told him that the army didn't have enough wagons or forage for the animals to pull the wagons, and said it was better just to defend against the Federals who could threaten Atlanta from Chattanooga. Johnston's overall plan was to fight defensively until the Union Army offered an opportunity to attack, and then, after handing the Union a decisive defeat, he would then invade Tennessee. The President and Johnston were once again butting heads. Johnston also wanted to free up more men to carry rifles. The jobs of teamsters and cooks took many men away from the front lines. He proposed to Davis that slaves or free African Americans be pressed into service in those jobs, freeing up white men to fire rifles. Patrick Cleburne, one of Johnston's division commanders, on January 4th, in a meeting with other officers, including Johnston, suggested that they arm slaves to fight for the Confederacy. He believed that that was the only way to solve the manpower issue. In the meeting, a few of the officers became enraged at the suggestion, most notably William H.T. Walker, who said such a suggestion was an act of treason on Cleburne's part. Johnston feared such a policy would divide the army further, and when he brought the matter to the President, Davis told Johnston to stamp out the idea, which he did. Davis wanted Johnston to go on the offensive, to take the Army of Tennessee north, through the mountains of Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and link up with James Longstreet's corps near Knoxville. From there, the combined force was to move west to Nashville and capture the city. Davis believed that such an offensive would draw the Union forces away from northern Georgia and prevent the Union Army from sending more troops to the Army of the Potomac opposing Robert E. Lee. Davis was insistent that Johnston was falsifying his statements about the preparedness of his army to keep from having to launch an offensive. So he sent 2 envoys from Richmond to inspect the Army of Tennessee. One of those men was one of Johnston's friends, William N. Pendleton. Both envoys came back to Richmond with word that the army wasn't equipped for such an offensive, or an offensive at all. The lack of draft animals to pull artillery and wagons was enough to immobilize the army. Despite the reports, Davis was adamant that it was Johnston's timidness that kept him from moving forward. Despite numerous reports from Johnston and his subordinates to the contrary, Davis still believed that Sherman was sending troops to Grant in Virginia. The president couldn't believe that the Union had enough troops to launch two massive offensives at the same time and believed the main offensive would be in Virginia. In May 1864, as most of Johnston's forces were at Dalton and Sherman's forces were around Ringgold, the Atlanta campaign began. Although minor attacks were made against Johnston's defensive position around Dalton and Rocky Face Ridge, one of Sherman's armies, the Army of Tennessee under James B. McPherson, launched a flanking maneuver to cut Johnston off from Atlanta by attacking the town of Resaca south of his position. A small force of a few thousand Confederates occupied the town, and the resistance they put up was enough to send McPherson back to Snake Creek Gap and await the rest of Sherman's forces. Johnston, scared of being cut off from Atlanta, began moving his forces to Resaca. As he did, Leonidas Polk, the warrior bishop, arrived from Mississippi with around 10,000 more men to add to Johnston's inferior numbers. At Resaca, Johnston defended the town from behind earthworks and resisted every attempt by Sherman to break through the defenses. However, a division of Federal soldiers crossed the Oostenaula River and threatened Johnston's communications to the south. It was a small force, but the reports Johnston received convinced him that he needed to pull back in order to protect his army. Even after Sherman moved his three armies against Johnston, Davis still insisted that Sherman was sending Grant more troops. Johnston, irritated at these assertions, wrote back, "We are in the presence of the whole force of the enemy assembled from Tennessee and North Alabama. I think he cannot reinforce Grant without my knowledge, nor do I think he will, as my whole line is engaged in skirmishing. Yesterday he made several assaults that were repulsed." Johnston suffered from a lack of cavalry, and the cavalry he did have didn't perform the scouting and screening operations that he needed in order to understand Sherman's movements. His cavalry was led by Joseph Wheeler. Wheeler didn't care to perform those duties. He was much more concentrated on fighting his Union counterparts than scouting. Johnston's plan suffered from a lack of information, due in large part to his cavalry commander's disinterest in performing the duties of cavalry. As Johnston pulled his army south of Resaca toward Adairsville, the general was already coming up with another plan to bring Sherman to battle. His engineers assured him that the valley in which Adairsville sat would allow the Army of Tennessee to cover the width of the valley and force Sherman to attack an entrenched position. When Johnston arrived to survey the location, he deemed it too vulnerable and decided to pull back further to a more advantageous location. It was during the study of a map that Johnston came up with a brilliant plan to land a decisive blow against Sherman and maybe send him out of Georgia and back into Tennessee. The road split from Adairsville, with one going to Kingston and the other going to Cassville. Johnston believed that Sherman would divide his forces to cover more ground quickly, and that his separation posed the greatest opportunity to land a decisive blow. Hardee's corps had been the rear guard of the army from Resaca, so if Hardee withdrew south to Kingston, Sherman would send the bulk of his force south, while sending smaller units to the southeast along a road to Cassville. Meanwhile, Polk and Hood's corps would move via that southeast road. When Sherman split his force, that smaller detachment would run into two of Johnston's corps across the road from Cassville. While Polk held the Union troops in place, Hood would strike at their left flank. Johnston was excited about the plan. The opportunity had arisen. He told his plan to his corps commanders, who fully endorsed the plan. But before the meeting broke up, Polk, the Episcopal bishop, stepped forward and handed Johnston a note. It was from Lydia to Polk, telling him that she wanted Johnston to be baptized, and not just baptized by the bishop himself. Johnston, the dutiful husband he was, agreed, and in a solemn ceremony, Johnston knelt to be baptized and received the sacrament from the warrior bishop. After that, the men left headquarters and began to execute their plan. Johnston was so confident in the plan that he wrote an official message to the army saying, "Soldiers of the Army of Tennessee, you have displayed the highest quality of the soldier, firmness in combat, patience under toil. By your courage and skill you have repulsed every assault of the enemy. You will now turn and march to meet his advancing columns. Fully confiding in the conduct of the officers, the courage of the soldiers, I'll lead you to battle." Sherman indeed split his forces just like Johnston believed he would. The column of blue troops taking the Cassville Road was the 23rd Corps under John M. Schofield and the 20th Corps under Joseph Hooker. The Union column engaged with Polk's troops on the road. They deployed into battle line, but Hood didn't make his attack. Johnston sent an aide to see what was the problem. Hood explained that a column of Federals of unknown size was on his right flank, and if he pushed forward, they would be in his rear. So Hood had pulled back. The opportunity had been missed. In his old age, Johnston still believed Hood had false reports of a Union column of troops on his flank. Johnston was so invested in the plan that he couldn't fathom a thought that it wasn't going to work. There indeed were troops on the flank, definitely cavalry and some infantry. In the situation, Hood couldn't tell how many, and didn't want to risk his corps or the entire army in launching the attack. Johnston then pulled south of the Etowah River and took up a position at Allatoona, awaiting the Federal army to advance again, but this time Sherman didn't want to confront Johnston head-on. He planned to swing his army to the west and outflank the Army of Tennessee and force Johnston to move closer to Atlanta. Johnston wrote to Lydia during these retreats, "There never was a time when the comfort of your love was more necessary to me, for I have never been so little satisfied with myself. I have seen so much beautiful country given up to the enemy as to be made unhappy by it. You cannot imagine how disheartening it is, and at the same time humiliating, to see the apprehension of the people of a country abandoned to the enemy. I had rather have the agony of defeat as far as my own feelings are concerned." Instead of falling back, this time Johnston moved his army to block Sherman's advance, and the two armies would clash at the battles of New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, and Dallas. Johnston and his subordinates successfully held off Sherman's attacks against those three locations at the end of May. Johnston coordinated the movement of troops and made sure that each sector had the necessary units to throw back the numerous attacks. At the Battle of Dallas, Johnston ordered his own attack. Part of Hardee's corps would attack the numerically superior Army of the Tennessee and gain no ground. The attack ground to a halt, and both sides took stock of their respective armies. Sherman didn't stay idle. He planned to move east again to threaten the Western and Atlantic Railroad and Johnston's link with Atlanta. Johnston's chief of staff, William McCall, came out of a meeting with Johnston and wrote home about the plan for the entire campaign. He wrote, "We have to keep close up to the enemy, watch carefully every moment, and then try and take advantage of every mistake Sherman makes. By doing so, we have thus far succeeded in making him pay 3 or 4 for one of ours out of a state of service by death or wounds. If we can keep this up, we win." After the battles of New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, and Dallas, Sherman moved his columns east, back to the Western and Atlantic Railroad, and so moved Johnston to block his path, taking up a position north of Marietta, Georgia, along some ridges known as Lost Mountain, Pine Mountain, and Brush Mountain. Johnston also called on the Georgia State Militia to come to the Chattahoochee River and fortify the crossings, fearing that the Union may move cavalry behind the Army of Tennessee and cause havoc on the communications and supplies from Atlanta. Johnston was scrambling for cavalry to push into the rear of the Union Army and sever communications by destroying railroads, bridges, and telegraph wires, but his own cavalry under Joseph Wheeler were too worn out for that type of exhausting duty. Plus, he didn't have any to spare because all of Wheeler's cavalry were screening the army and scouting the Federal position. So he called on Stephen D. Lee in Mississippi to send at least one brigade of cavalry into Tennessee to break up Sherman's supplies, but Lee was expected to keep in control of Mississippi with just a small token force, and he couldn't help. He then called on Nathan Bedford Forrest to help by raiding Sherman's supplies and communications, and since Forrest, like Lee, was outside of Johnston's command, Joe pleaded with the president to send Forrest's men on a raid. He even asked his corps commanders to write the president asking for such a movement. Both Hardee and Polk did so. Jefferson Davis and his military advisor Braxton Bragg both told him to use his own cavalry for the operation and declined to send Forrest on a raid. It was now mid-June, and Johnston asked Hardee to come with him to have a look at the Confederate and Union positions around Pine Mountain. Leonidas Polk would join them. It was around 11 a.m. when the three generals examined a battery emplacement, and Johnston judged it too vulnerable if an attack was made and ordered Hardee to pull the troops back at nightfall. The group of officers attracted the attention of Union artillerymen, and artillery shells began to fly through the air near the men. This convinced Johnston and Hardee to leave the location, but Polk lingered for a moment. At that moment, a shell passed through Polk's body, killing him instantly. Johnston looked over to see his corps commander on the ground and ran over to him, knelt down and put his hand on Polk's forehead, saying, "I would rather anything but this." He wrote to Davis informing him of the warrior bishop's death, and then wrote a message to the army saying, "In this distinguished leader we have lost the most courteous of gentlemen, the most gallant of soldiers. The Christian patriot soldier has neither lived nor died in vain. His example is before you. His mantle rests with you. Johnston again pulled his army back to a better location at Kennesaw Mountain, close to the town of Marietta. Fearing that his left flank was exposed to a flanking maneuver that Sherman had become famous for now, he moved Hood's troops to the left, where Hood engaged with a Federal force at the Battle of Colb's Farm. Hood wasn't authorized to launch an attack, just defend, but when he did attack, he found at least 2 corps in his front and was forced to fall back. Johnston's friend, the Texas Senator Louis T. Wigfall, joined Johnston in Marietta to see what the military situation was and bring his friend news from the rumor mill that was Richmond. Wigfall warned Johnston that there were serious rumors that the president was going to have him removed as army commander. That didn't bother Johnston. He believed that just because the president orders something doesn't mean it was the best strategy. What did bother Johnston was the person rumored to replace him, John Bell Hood. Johnston began to rethink his friendship with Hood and suspected him of being in Davis's pocket, which Hood essentially was. On June 27th, Johnston wrote to Bragg about the military situation, pleading with him to help the Army of Tennessee in this campaign. I have been unable so far to stop the enemy's progress by gradual approaches on account of his numerous army and the character of the country, which is favorable to his method. Our best mode of operating against it would be to use strong parties of cavalry to cut his railroad communications. Our own cavalry is so weak compared with that of the Federal Army that I have been unable to do it. If you can employ cavalry in that way quickly, great benefit must result from it, probably Sherman's speedy discomfiture. At Kennesaw Mountain, Johnston got what he wanted since the beginning of the war, the enemy to launch a frontal assault against his lines. Multiple attacks were launched against the Confederate works dotting the landscape around Kennesaw Mountain, and Johnston's troops threw every one of them back, even the most concerted effort at what became known as the Dead Angle, occupied by Division Commander Benjamin F. Cheatham and his troops. Despite Davis and Bragg's insistence that no other cavalry forces from outside Georgia would be available to cut Sherman's supply lines, Johnston kept requesting that very action. It wasn't entirely Davis and Bragg's fault either. Wheeler, in a bit of mismanagement, regularly sent in his reports with his aggregate present numbers, which numbered around 17,000 cavalry, but he only had a little over 2,000 effectives that he could use in cavalry operations. The others had lost horses, were sick, on leave, or otherwise unable to operate with the Army of Tennessee. Johnston sent those false numbers to Davis and Bragg, and thus the president and his advisor believed Johnston possessed enough cavalry. Senator Benjamin H. Hill of Georgia, before going to Washington, went to visit Johnston and talk about his strategy. Obviously, the senator was concerned over his state, and he wanted to know if Johnston planned on retreating south of the Chattahoochee River. Johnston assured him that he could hold out north of the river for at least a month. Hill was an ally of Davis and planned on bringing the information to the president. Not long after Hill left Johnston, the Army of Tennessee would be retreating again from their position around Kennesaw Mountain toward the Chattahoochee River. At the river, Confederate engineers devised a set of earthworks that hopefully a single corps could occupy and defend the river crossings, while the rest of the army launched offensives at Sherman's army, attempting to cross the river. Light skirmishing occurred along this line, but Sherman was already putting troops on the south side of the river. Johnston didn't want to attack an entrenched enemy, and so the Army of Tennessee pulled back once again, south of the river. At about the same time Davis was informed of this movement, Senator Hill delivered the message that Johnston said he could hold out north of the Chattahoochee River for a month. He had only lasted a few days. This would be the last straw for Davis, who felt leaving Johnston in command of the army would only result in more ground being given up. To make certain that Johnston wouldn't protect Atlanta, Davis sent Bragg to visit with Johnston, and while his emissary traveled to Georgia, Davis went in deep thought about who to replace Johnston with. Edwin Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi West would be a candidate, but he was an opponent of Bragg, and the logical choice of raising Corps Commander William Hardee to that rank was dashed because he was also anti-Bragg and had declined to be considered for command of the army in the past. John Bell Hood looked to be the only option. Davis wrote to Robert E. Lee and asked him a question. Johnston has failed. It seems necessary to relieve him at once. Who should succeed him? What think you of Hood for the position? Lee replied, "It is a bad time to release the commander of an army situated as that of Tennessee. We may lose Atlanta and the army too. Hood is a bold fighter, I am doubtful as to the other qualities necessary." Later that day, Lee wrote to Davis again, saying, "It would be better to concentrate all the cavalry in Mississippi and Tennessee on Sherman's communications." Bragg's assignment to visit Johnston was only to gain ammunition against Johnston. Bragg arrived at Johnston's headquarters, and they talked for 12 hours, and according to Bragg, Johnston did not ask for advice, nor did Bragg offer any. They discussed the condition of the army, which was much worse than Bragg and Davis believed, and the next day, Johnston brought his corps commanders to headquarters so that Bragg could ask them any questions, or if he needed any clarification about the state of the army or the goings-on of the campaign. Bragg insisted that the visit was unofficial, as he was going to visit Stephen D. Lee in Mississippi, but he would meet with the corps commanders separately. Bragg only met with 2 of Johnston's subordinates, Hood and Wheeler, both of whom were Bragg's supporters. Hood insisted that Johnston had refused to act offensively against Sherman, and that Hood repeatedly asked to attack, but his suggestions were waved off by the army commander. Hood also gave Bragg a letter that attacked Johnston as the army commander and discredited him as a strategist. Bragg would write to Davis, "If any change is made, Lieutenant General Hood would give unlimited satisfaction, and my estimate of him, always high, has been raised by his conduct in this campaign." Davis wanted to give Johnston one more chance to assure him that the Army of Tennessee would defend Atlanta. He telegraphed Johnston, "I wish to hear from you as to present situation and your plans of operations so specifically as will enable me to anticipate events." Johnston responded, "As the enemy double our number, we must be on the defensive. My plan of operations must, therefore, depend upon the enemy. It is mainly to watch for an opportunity to fight to advantage. We are trying to put Atlanta in condition to be held for a day or two by the Georgia militia, that army movements may be freer and wider." The message astonished Davis. Was Johnston just going to hold Atlanta for a day or two? Without any solid stance provided by Johnston as to his defense of the city, this message signaled the death knell for Johnston's time as the army commander. On July 17th, as Johnston sat at his headquarters 3 miles north of Atlanta, a courier brought him a telegram from Samuel Cooper. It read, "Lieutenant General J.B. Hood has been commissioned to the temporary rank of general under the late law of Congress. I am directed by the Secretary of War to inform you that as you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta, far in the interior of Georgia, and express no confidence of the Army and the Department of Tennessee, which you will immediately turn over to General Hood." Out of courtesy, Hood asked Johnston to stay on until the fate of Atlanta had been decided, but Johnston knew he could not disobey a direct order. Still, Johnston sought the President's ability to rescind the order, but the reply was, "The order has been executed, and I cannot suspend it without making the case worse." Johnston wrote a message to the army. "I cannot leave this noble army without expressing my admiration of the high military qualities it has displayed. A long and arduous campaign has made conspicuous every soldierly virtue, endurance of toil, obedience to orders, brilliant courage. The enemy has never attacked but to be repulsed and severely punished. You soldiers have never argued but from your courage, and never counted your foes. No longer your leader, I will watch your career, and will rejoice in your victories." In a letter to Samuel Cooper, he acknowledged the order removing him from command and wrote a quick retort. Confident language by a military commander is not usually regarded as evidence of competency. Johnston left Atlanta and went to Macon, where he moved into a house with Lydia and the Wigfall's daughters. He instantly became a celebrity in the town, with the townspeople gathering around him and shaking his hand and applauded him. He remained at that rented home as news of the battles around Atlanta came in. Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Ezra Church piled up casualties for the Confederacy. In between those battles, Bragg came to visit Hood and discuss strategy. When he came to headquarters, William W. McCall, both Bragg and later Johnston's chief of staff, entered the room, and when Bragg greeted McCall, the chief of staff refused to shake his hand, believing that Bragg stabbed Johnston in the back by supporting his removal. The next day, McCall was relieved as chief of staff for Hood. Atlanta fell in September, and the lease on the house Johnston and Lydia lived in was coming up in October. When it did, McCall welcomed them into his home at Vineville. As Sherman tore through Georgia on his way to the sea, Johnston and Lydia moved to Columbia, South Carolina, where some of her family and his friends lived. By Christmas, Johnston went to Richmond at the request of his friends to defend his official report of the Atlanta campaign because they feared the president would discredit him. Davis did exactly that, basically calling Johnston a liar. Congress debated the merits of the report and Davis's rebuttal, and Johnston was given an honored seat as his allies praised his abilities in order to attack Davis. The debate was unsatisfactory to Johnston, and he went back to Columbia, staying there until Sherman began marching north. He sent Lydia to western North Carolina as he offered his services to defend the city, but when that became untenable, he traveled to western North Carolina to be with Lydia. From there, he learned that the Confederate Congress had wrestled control of the war away from Davis by making Robert E. Lee General-in-Chief of the Confederacy and naming him the commander of the Army of Tennessee. Despite Congress passing this bill, it was still up to Davis to make the appointments, but it basically backed him into a corner. Johnston realized this and said that Congress had violated an excellent rule, that of confining oneself to one's own business. It was not the job of Congress, he believed, to appoint generals. For better or worse, that was the president's responsibility. Davis willingly placed Lee as general-in-chief, but refused to make Johnston the commander of the Army of Tennessee. He wrote a 4,000-word response outlining Johnston's failings as a commander, but never submitted it to Congress. He concluded in it, "My opinion of General Johnston's unfitness for command has ripened slowly and against my inclinations into a conviction so settled that it would be impossible for me again to feel confidence in him as the commander of an army in the field." After Lee encouraged Davis, the president finally appointed Johnston, but Johnston didn't trust the action. He was convinced that he was placed in command just so he would be the one to surrender the army, and so he could take the blame for the collapse of the Confederacy, ultimately becoming a scapegoat for others. He began to think differently when he heard that Lee was his biggest advocate. For years, Johnston resented Lee and became jealous when he did great things with Johnston's former army. Now he found a new love for Lee, one he hadn't felt since early in the war. He would write, "In my youth and early manhood, I loved and admired him more than any man in the world. Since then, we have had little intercourse, and have become formal in our personal intercourse. I have long thought that he had forgotten our early friendship. Be assured that not of old never fought under his king more loyally than I'll serve under General Lee." Johnston now on paper essentially commanded all Confederate forces east of the Mississippi River, except Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. His first two objectives was to concentrate what forces he could and get them fed. He took over a buildup of supplies at Charlotte and began to bring his forces together across the state of North Carolina. Braxton Bragg now commanded troops in the eastern portion of the state and ironically served under Johnston. More ironic, he now requested reinforcements, just like Johnston had requested prior to the Atlanta campaign. Bragg had refused to give reinforcements to Johnston, but in an effort to be the bigger person, Johnston reinforced Bragg with the few troops he had. All the forces in the state numbered about 20,000, and now Johnston had divided those, but he hoped to slow down Sherman and, if possible, deliver a blow to stop him. Johnston concentrated his forces and planned to land a blow to Sherman at Bentonville, using the same tactic that he had planned to use at Cassville the year before. He would lure Sherman's isolated left wing to attack one of his forces, and once the Federals were engaged and occupied by the Confederates in their front, he would launch a flank attack with the rest of his army and hopefully drive them from the field. At the Battle of Bentonville, delays in getting his troops to the field weakened the attack, but he was successful in launching a flanking attack and scattering the Federals, but only temporarily. The Federals renewed their attacks, and although they broke through the Confederate lines a few times, Johnston was able to plug the hole and send the Federals back. Johnston remained on the field for a couple days, but Sherman planned to flank him, so he was forced to withdraw from the field. The Battle of Bentonville wasn't a stunning victory for the Confederacy, but it did prove that the Army of Tennessee would still fight. By April, the situation was becoming worse, especially in Virginia. Lee evacuated Richmond and Petersburg and headed west. Johnston hoped that it would result in Lee linking up with him in North Carolina. After the evacuation of Richmond, Davis went to North Carolina and called Johnston and Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard to meet with him there. On April 12th, Davis met with the two generals in his private train car. 3 other cabinet members were there: Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State, Stephen Mallory, the Secretary of Navy, and John H. Reagan, the Postmaster General. Davis talked about Johnston calling for deserters to rejoin the army, but Johnston said the men who abandoned the army in good times would not return in bad times. Davis ended the meeting and said it would reconvene that evening when the Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge, would arrive. Meanwhile, Johnston, Beauregard, and Mallory held their own meeting, and Mallory asked Johnston what should be done. Johnston said to end the war now and stop the fighting. Mallory agreed and asked Johnston to present the idea to Davis that evening. Breckinridge arrived with word that the rumors Johnston and the others had heard on their way to Goldsboro that Lee had surrendered was correct. In the meeting, Davis said the situation was terrible but not fatal, that if the people would simply turn out, then the Confederacy could win the war. When asked what Johnston thought, he responded, "Our country is overrun, its military resources greatly diminished, while the enemy's military power and resources were never greater and may be increased to any extent desired. My men are daily deserting in large numbers and are stealing my artillery teams to aid their escapes to their homes. Since Lee's surrender, they regard the war as at an end. If I march out of North Carolina, her people will all leave my ranks. My small force is melting away like snow before the sun, and I am hopeless of recruiting it." After an extended silence, Davis asked Beauregard what he would do. Beauregard concurred with Johnston on every point. Davis didn't believe that the United States would meet with him to end the war, since it didn't recognize the Confederacy. Johnston thought that since military commanders in the past had initiated peace terms, that Sherman might interact with himself in constructing a peace treaty. Davis was reluctant, but wrote out an official statement asking to terminate the existing war and entrusting it to Johnston. Johnston gave it to Wade Hampton's cavalry to take to Sherman. Sherman agreed to meet, and a place on the Raleigh Road was chosen as the meeting place. It was a wood cabin owned by James Bennett. On April 17th, Sherman and Johnston met. Sherman opened the discussion with a telegram about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Johnston was troubled by the news, hoping that Sherman didn't believe it had been a Southern plot. Sherman assured him that he didn't think that the Confederate Army had anything to do with it, but couldn't say the same about Jefferson Davis. Sherman offered the same terms that Ulysses S. Grant gave Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, but Johnston, to halt the bloodshed, offered a permanent peace. Sherman was unsure about Johnston's authority to do so, but was informed that Breckinridge, the Secretary of War, would be in that evening, and he could speak for the government. Sherman agreed, and they agreed to meet the next day. The meeting between Breckinridge, Johnston, and Sherman produced a signed document dissolving all Confederate armies and restoring the state government of the Confederacy. Johnston believed that he had just signed the document that ended the war, but it was not to be. Sherman found that the United States government felt Sherman overstepped his bounds in discussing political matters and declared the document void. Sherman notified Johnston that hostilities would commence, but was willing to meet with him again. Johnston sought advice from Breckinridge about a surrender, and Breckinridge said for him to surrender the infantry but keep the cavalry, basically keeping Jefferson Davis in power for a few more days. But Johnston believed that wasn't wise, saying, "We have to save the people, spare the blood of the army, and save the high civil functionaries. Your plan, I think, can only do the last." On April 26, 1865, Johnston met with Sherman and surrendered all of the troops under his command, the largest single surrender of Confederate forces of the war. Davis, upon hearing of Johnston's surrender, believed that the general committed treason surrendering an army without being surrounded. On May 2nd, Johnston issued his last general order. "Comrades, in terminating our official relations, I most earnestly exhort you to observe faithfully the terms of pacification agreed upon, and to discharge the obligations of good and peaceful citizens at your homes as well as you have performed the duties of thorough soldiers in the field. By such a course you will best secure the comfort of your families and kindred and restore tranquility to your country. You will return to your homes with the admiration of our people, won by the courage and noble devotion you have displayed in this long war. I shall always remember with pride the loyal support and generous confidence you have given me. I now part with you with deep regret, and bid you farewell with feelings of cordial friendship, and with earnest wishes that you may have hereafter all the prosperity and happiness to be found in the world." In the first few months after Johnston surrendered his forces to William T. Sherman at Bennett Place, Johnston stayed in the Greensboro area and looked for a job. He had been a soldier for around 35 years, and that was pretty much the only life he knew. His wife reached out to friends and family, attempting to secure her husband some kind of job to, as she put it, keep the kettle boiling. However, Lydia's health was failing. Johnston said that her health waned with the weather, and he grew ever more concerned about her health, knowing that he needed some kind of employment if he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. For a short time he worked for the National Express and Transportation Company, then spent a year and a half working for the Alabama and Tennessee River Railroad Company, later named the Selma, Rome, and Dalton Railroad. He found the job boring, and both him and Lydia were incredibly unhappy while he was president of the railroad. He finally found permanent employment in insurance, working as an agent for the London-based Liverpool and London and Globe Insurance Company. After visiting the home office in England, Johnston returned to the United States, setting up his home office and the branch of the company named Joseph E. Johnston and Company, where he oversaw the parent company's Southern Department. His company was profitable, presiding over 120 agents in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. He and Lydia, for her health, spent summers in Warm Springs, Virginia, hoping to reap the benefits of the mineral springs there. Now that Johnston found permanent employment as an insurance agent, he had time to work on his memoirs, in an attempt to defend his wartime record. He wrote to corps and division commanders, except Hood, asking them to send him papers, or even better, write reminiscences of the war. When those men didn't satisfy his questions, he prodded them to reconsider sections that didn't align with his way of viewing the war, particularly the Atlanta campaign. Hood wasn't Johnston's only target. Johnston wanted Jefferson Davis to take a large portion, if not all of the blame, for the defeat of the Confederacy. But there was a problem. Davis's imprisonment at Fort Monroe for about 2 years created a martyr to the Confederate cause, and people began to look at the former president differently than they had during the war. Wade Hampton, Johnston's cavalry commander in North Carolina at the tail end of the war, wrote to Johnston asking for a letter of recommendation to the Viceroy of Egypt to hopefully be named an officer in that army, like other Confederates did. Hampton knew that Johnston was attacking Davis publicly, but thought that hurt the unity of the South in the post-war years. He wrote to Johnston, "I feel sure no good can come in any way by any publication by you raising an issue on the point. Any controversy between Mr. Davis and yourself would jar upon the feelings of thousands who are friendly to both of you, and would tend to throw discredit on our cause. Do not allow yourself to be drawn into any personal altercation." Johnston's book was published in 1874, entitled Narrative of Military Operations Directed During the Late War Between the States. Through his dry narrative of his Civil War career, Johnston attacked Davis on multiple topics, including Davis ranking Robert E. Lee, Samuel Cooper, and Albert Sidney Johnston higher than himself within the Confederate military. Unfortunately for Johnston, others saw the attack as petty, especially since Lee had become such a beloved figure in the minds of Southerners. His section on Vicksburg was particularly confusing because he insisted that Theophilus Holmes in Arkansas possessed 55,000 men, and if he and Pemberton had just linked up, then they could have defeated Ulysses S. Grant outright. Holmes, from most estimates, numbered his army at around 10,000, but Johnston never would accept that Holmes didn't have a larger force. Included in the book was a line-by-line rebuttal to the message Davis wrote but never submitted to the Confederate Congress, outlining his problems with putting Johnston in command of the Army of Tennessee at the end of the war. The book sold poorly, and the publisher lost money, and Johnston alienated many people by blaming them. One of Johnston's biographers wrote about the publication that, by 1874, many of the Southern states had been redeemed, returned to home rule. What Southerners wanted to remember about the war was their devotion and sacrifice, not their mistakes, whoever made them. They wanted to believe that their soldiers had been heroic, their generals cunning and bold, their government supportive and determined. The principal theme of the Southern literature on the war was that the South had been overwhelmed by superior numbers. Most were perfectly willing to believe that all their leaders had been heroes. The book's poor reception was a disappointment to Johnston. Years later, when a prospective biographer wrote to ask him to bless his project, the old general warned him that the public was not interested and prophesied that the publication would be a dead loss. Not only did Johnston attack Davis, he attacked Hood to a great degree, but by the time Johnston's book came out, Hood's Tennessee campaign was universally understood as a complete failure. Johnston's attacks didn't lower Hood's standing, but Hood also wrote his own book, called Advance and Retreat. In it, Hood believed Johnston had ruined the Army of Tennessee before he ever took command of it, by retreating and losing more soldiers than he actually reported in the Atlanta campaign. Unfortunately for Johnston, Hood died in 1879, the same year Hood's book came out. In death, Hood had eluded facing Johnston's rebuttal. In 1877, Davis's book, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, was published, but try as he might, Johnston couldn't really find any attack on himself. Davis focused most of his attention on the legality of secession and politics rather than the military. Davis had defeated Johnston again, this time by not engaging with the general. On a train ride from Savannah, Georgia to Richmond, Virginia, Johnston had a deep and lengthy conversation with Frank A. Burr that continued once they got to the city. Burr was a reporter for the Philadelphia Press, and he asked Johnston questions about the end of the war. One of the questions was what happened to the Confederate gold reserves. Johnston claimed that only $179,000 worth was accounted for out of the $2 million that was in the reserves. Johnston also stated that Davis never did give a satisfactory answer to where it went. Burr ran the story on December 18, 1881, with the headline, "Confederate Gold Missing. General Johnston called Jefferson Davis to account for over $2 million in specie." Davis was angered by the accusation, and it only made people feel sorry for Johnston, who they saw as more pathetic in his assertions. Davis was so disgusted by Johnston's statements and actions that he refused to come to the dedication of a statue to Robert E. Lee because Johnston was the president of the Lee Memorial Association. The editors of Century magazine wanted Johnston to write an article for their publication, and Johnston accepted. Using the article to rebut many of Davis's accusations, Johnston denounced that Davis was on the battlefield at First Manassas as the battle was taking place. But his most volatile section of the article didn't pertain to Davis. It was the Battle of Seven Pines. First, Johnston quoted the initial casualty list made by the combatants instead of using the corrected numbers that both sides later reported. When the editors corrected his numbers, he was adamant that the numbers remained the way he recounted them, despite them being wrong. They settled on adding a footnote to include the real casualty numbers. Second, Johnston didn't like the map published with the article about Seven Pines. The map showed the Union position as one line instead of two sections, which he thought made his plan outlined in the article look foolhardy. The editors used the map, but did include an explanation that the map depicted the Union battle line after the attacks. Johnston met with one of the editors, Robert Johnson, in the lobby of the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York City and argued with him, raising his voice and yelling at the editor. As with many of his temper flare-ups, Johnston felt bad afterwards and apologized to the man. One of Johnston's biographers explained that Johnston's behavior contrasted markedly with that of his old classmate Robert E. Lee, who adopted a dignified silence about all questions concerning the war. Lee wrote no memoir and even refused interviews on the subject. Because Lee accepted full public responsibility for all his actions, the public concluded that he was not responsible at all, and his quiet stoicism elevated him to Southern sainthood after his death in 1870. By contrast, Johnston's continued insistence that he was not at fault led many to assume he was probably guilty. In the years after the war, Joe Johnston became the father figure of the family, even though he wasn't the oldest living brother of the family. His older brother Peter was stricken with ill health and poverty. When Joe's nephew, John W. Johnston, informed his uncle that Peter was sick and alone in the house at Abingdon, Joe hired a man to stay with Peter and help him. Joe also secured Peter a job under a local attorney, but Joe paid his brother's salary unbeknownst to Peter, because Peter wouldn't take charity. When his brother Beverly died, Joe and the rest of the family agreed to sell the estate in Abingdon. He put Peter up in a hotel and rented the room for him. When a family member wanted to name their son Joe after him, the old general asked for an act of kindness and not name a child Joe because it is a name unbecoming of a gentleman and something he himself had suffered with throughout his life. Johnston began to show great interest in politics. When the Hawaiian Reciprocity Treaty came to the floor of Congress, which would allow a custom-free exchange of agricultural goods between the United States and the Kingdom of Hawaii, Johnston wrote to his nephew in the Senate asserting that this would hurt Southern planters who grew sugar and rice. His nephew voted against the treaty, but it passed anyway. In the election of 1876, the volatile election garnered Johnston's attention also. When Tilden resigned himself to defeat at the hands of Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, Johnston thought Tilden should have fought harder to be president. He wrote, "If he had the heart of a dunghill hen, he would have claimed the presidency and been inaugurated. It is as certain as any matter of opinion that if he had been resolute, he would have been backed by the whole Democrat party, against which Grant would not have attempted to use his little military force." The winter of 1876 to 77 saw Johnston and Lydia move to Richmond, Virginia. In 1878, the local Democratic committee approached him to run for the U.S. Congress. Johnston said he would if he didn't have to campaign, that he wanted it to be presented to him by the will of the people, and his acceptance would be his duty. They assured him that he wouldn't have to canvass, but this was false, and Johnston didn't like having to sell himself to all classes of people. He felt that his name and reputation should speak for itself. His biggest opponents were greenbackers, who promised a cheap money policy. Johnston believed this was a false promise and saw the election as good versus evil. Johnston blamed what he called the carpetbagger government, which forced the planting class to borrow heavily against their crops, sending them into debt. In this way, the greenbackers appealed to not only the formerly wealthy, but also the poor. Johnston campaigned hard to discredit the greenbackers, insisting that cheap money to the people would also be cheap money to the creditors. But as November drew near, he feared that he hadn't been able to convince the public. Johnston did win the election and became congressman. However, his time in Congress was uneventful. He was on the Committee of Military Affairs, and in that role he visited West Point, but he rarely spoke on the House floor. Disillusioned with politics, he decided not to run for another term. The election of 1880 saw two Union generals face off for the presidency, Republican James A. Garfield and Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock. Johnston believed that Hancock was one of the last hopes for the Democratic Party to gain a foothold in national politics, but when Hancock was defeated, Johnston was distraught. When Democrat Grover Cleveland won the presidency in 1884, Johnston's name was on the list for being Secretary of War, but Cleveland's advisors thought better, thinking that the nation wouldn't accept the former rebel in that position. So Cleveland named Johnston the U.S. Railroad Commissioner. It would be his job to inspect the rail lines across the United States. Every summer he would crisscross the nation to write his report on the status of the railroads. Most of the time he traveled 200 miles a day by rail for his inspections. He never wanted an idle life, and this kept him on his feet in his old age. On February 22, 1887, Lydia passed away at the age of 65. Johnston was devastated and couldn't bring himself to write or speak her name afterward. He was too heartbroken. He compensated for the heartache by working harder, but in 1888, Cleveland was defeated by Union veteran Benjamin Harrison, and Johnston was removed from his position as commissioner. Johnston blamed the Republican victory on that party's assembling of black voters at the polls, and he feared that by the Republicans using black voters, that the Democratic Party would never regain dominance. When his time in the government was over, he retired to his home on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. In his retirement, Atlanta, Georgia was set to unveil a Confederate monument, and Johnston was invited to come take part in the ceremony. He shared an open carriage with one of his former staffers and fellow Confederate general, Edmund Kirby Smith. As the carriage rode slowly by a crowd, a soldier said, "That's Johnston! That's Joe Johnston!" Then a massive crowd surrounded the carriage, hands and arms extended into the carriage to shake the general's hand. The horses pulling the carriage were unhitched, and the old veterans of the Army of Tennessee pulled Johnston's carriage to the ceremony site. Tears came streaming down the old general's face, realizing that the men still loved him for what he did for them. At the unveiling of the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Johnston became part of the ceremony, helping to unveil the statue of his friend. All kinds of visitors came to visit with him in the post-war years. When many of his fellow Confederates turned their backs on him, Union veterans praised him. Both Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman, and especially Sherman, acknowledged the great abilities of Johnston, and those two became good friends. In 1885, he was actually one of the pallbearers for Grant's funeral, and he also performed that task for his pre-war friend and wartime adversary, George B. McClellan. In 1891, Johnston traveled to New York to be a pallbearer for his friend Sherman. It was a cold and wet February day when they laid the Union general to rest, and Johnston mourned with his head uncovered. Someone told him to put his hat on to keep him from catching a cold, but he said, "If I were in his place and he were standing here in mine, he would not put on his hat." Johnston did catch a cold, and it got progressively worse. The old general had labored breathing, which lasted weeks. His brother-in-law, Robert McLean, sat with him every evening until Johnston went to sleep. On March 21, 1891, as McLean left Johnston's home on his way back to his own house, Russell, Johnston's black attendant, came running to McLean saying that Johnston was failing. McLean rushed back over to Johnston's home, and at a few minutes past 11, Johnston passed away. Some of the first callers to Johnston's home for visitation were two Union generals, William S. Rosecrans and John M. Schofield. After the funeral, Johnston's body was laid to rest in Green Mount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, next to his wife Lydia. Joseph E. Johnston was a leader of men, as exhibited by inspiration instilled in the Confederate troops on the First Manassas battlefield and the loyalty of the Army of Tennessee to him. Despite not winning many major victories, his troops loved him and would do what they could for him. Johnston's first objectives when he took command of troops was to get them fed and equipped, and the men loved him for it. They trusted him despite his retreats. Yes, indeed, Johnston gave up a lot of ground as commander of various Confederate forces. His lack of aggression is legendary, and his search for perfection of a situation or plan hindered his fighting ability. His temper got the better of him on many occasions with subordinates and superiors, particularly Davis. If he felt slighted, Johnston never could forget the attack, and most famously went on the attack verbally and through the written word to regain his honor. Johnston's contemporaries and historians have and still debate the merits and failures of Johnston's withdrawals across the southern landscape. To a certain degree, the retreats were understandable, but how far could one retreat, waiting on the right opportunity to strike? For some, it seemed like he would never strike. Part of it was his opponent in the Atlanta campaign, William T. Sherman. Sherman didn't want to launch headlong assaults against an entrenched enemy, and resolved to flank Johnston, avoiding battle. Nevertheless, he did delay the Union general. Although there was blame to go around to all parties, President Davis, Braxton Bragg, Judah Benjamin, and John Bell Hood made life difficult for Johnston. Sometimes he brought it on himself, and other times he didn't. But he never could let a grudge die, and he spent many of his post-war years trying to reclaim his name, a name that was beloved by the men who served under him. Sam Watkins of Company H of the 1st Tennessee Infantry said it best. Such a man was Joseph E. Johnston, and such his record. Farewell, old fellow. We privates loved you because you made us love ourselves.